Hey everyone! I'm your narrator here to guide you today. I know you're using this video to relax or maybe to fall asleep. But before we get started, do me a quick favor. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this from, and what time is it for you right now? Alright, get cozy and let yourself unwind. The story I'm about to share is one of those that crawls under your skin and leaves you questioning reality. Cameras, they were everywhere. In the kitchen clock, behind the bathroom mirror, even in the houseplants. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. But now, I knew someone had been watching my every move for days. Let me start from the beginning. It was supposed to be an easy gig. My college roommate's parents needed someone to house sit while they were on vacation in Europe for 2 weeks. The pay was good, the house was beautiful, and I'd have plenty of time to work on my thesis. A win-win situation, right? Well, wrong. The first few days were uneventful. I settled into a routine, waking up, making coffee, working on my laptop for a few hours, maybe taking a dip in the backyard pool if the weather was nice. It was pretty comfortable, all things considered. Then, on the 4th night, things started to feel off. I was sitting on the couch, reading, when an intense urge made me glance over my shoulder. Or I'd be in the shower, and I'd swear I heard movement just outside the curtain. I chalked it up to nerves. Being alone in a strange house can do that to you, right? But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it got stronger with each passing day. And then, I found the first camera. I was dusting the mantel. Hey, I take my house-sitting duties seriously, when something odd caught my eye in one of the family photos. The frame was noticeably thicker than the others. Curious, I picked it up to inspect it more closely. That's when I saw it, a tiny lens, no bigger than the head of a pin, tucked discreetly into the corner of the frame. My blood ran cold. All those moments of unease suddenly made a horrifying kind of sense. With my heart pounding, I began searching the house more thoroughly. Over the next hour, I found 6 more hidden cameras. They were everywhere, in the living room, the kitchen, my bedroom, even the bathroom. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that every inch of this house was under surveillance. But why? And more importantly, who was behind this? I considered calling the police, but what would I even tell them? That I'd found a few cameras in a house I was just house-sitting? For all I knew, the homeowners might have installed them for security purposes. Unlikely, given how well hidden they were, but I couldn't rule it out. I needed more information before involving the authorities. So, I decided to play it cool. The next day, I went about my usual routine, pretending nothing had changed. I made sure not to give any hints that I'd discovered the cameras. Meanwhile, I took careful notes on everything I'd found, every location, every camera, every detail. I searched for patterns. Most of the cameras seemed to be wireless, likely transmitting to a receiver somewhere nearby. If I could locate that, I might be able to trace it back to whoever was watching. As night fell, I put my plan into action. I turned on every TV and radio in the house, cranking the volume up to the max. The noise would drown out any sounds I made and, hopefully, mask my true intentions from whoever might be monitoring. I began my search in the basement, combing through every nook and cranny. Nothing. The first floor yielded similar results, no sign of anything unusual. By the time I reached the 2nd floor, my hope was beginning to wane. And then I saw it. A faintly ajar attic access panel in the hallway ceiling. It was barely noticeable, something you wouldn't even think twice about unless you were looking for it. Bingo. Heart pounding, I quietly pulled down the folding ladder. Every creak of the old wood sent a surge of adrenaline through me. What was I about to find up there? More importantly, would someone, or something, be waiting? I ascended slowly, every sense on high alert. The attic was dark, musty, and cluttered with the usual assortment of boxes and old furniture. But in the far corner, I noticed a faint blue glow. Moving carefully, I crept toward it, and there it was. A laptop hooked up to a series of small monitors. Each screen displayed a live feed of different rooms in the house. And then I saw myself, standing in the attic, illuminated by the eerie electronic light. I had found the surveillance hub. Now, I just needed to figure out who was behind it. The laptop was, of course, password protected. I wasn't a hacker, but I knew enough to check the browser history. Most of it had been wiped clean, but a few entries remained. What I found made my blood run cold. Multiple searches for my name. Social media profiles. College records. Whoever was behind this wasn't just watching the house, they were watching me. Suddenly, I heard a door slam outside. Panic surged through me. I bolted to the attic window and peered out. A shadowy figure was moving toward the house. I had to get out. Now. I scrambled down the attic ladder, no longer caring about the noise. My only thought was escape. I sprinted to my bedroom, grabbed my phone and wallet, and headed for the stairs. That's when I heard the front door open. I froze, one foot hovering above the last step. Heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the house. Whoever it was, they knew I was there. My mind raced. The back door was locked. Reaching it in time was impossible. The windows? No chance. I was trapped on the second floor. The footsteps began ascending the stairs. In a moment of desperation, I darted into the master bedroom and locked the door. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might buy me enough time to think. Now, I could hear them in the hallway, testing the doors. They were methodical, deliberate. It was only a matter of time before they found me. The window. It was my only option. I dashed to it and I threw the window open, and the fresh night air hit my face as I looked down. It was a long drop to the backyard, but there was a slanted section of the roof just below. If I could slide down there, I might reach the pool without breaking any bones. The doorknob rattled. Then, a loud bang as someone shoved against it. Time was running out. I climbed out onto the window ledge just as another bang echoed behind me, splintering the doorframe. Taking a deep breath, I let myself drop. The rough shingles scraped against my skin as I slid, desperately trying to control my descent. I landed hard on the gutter, tumbling over the edge and falling the last few feet. With a splash, I hit the pool, the icy water forcing the air from my lungs. For a moment, I just floated there, stunned. Then instinct took over. I swam to the edge, gasping and coughing as I pulled myself out. Inside the house, I could hear shouting. They knew I'd escaped. Soaking wet and trembling, I bolted for the back fence. I barely managed to climb over it before the back door slammed open. Beams of flashlight cut through the darkness behind me. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, through backyards, down alleys, across streets. I didn't have a destination, just an overwhelming need to get as far away from that house as possible. Finally, I stumbled into a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The waitress gave me a concerned look as I staggered in. "Honey, are you okay?" she asked, already reaching for the phone. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. "I need to call the police." The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. I told them everything, the cameras, the attic, the intruder. At first, they seemed skeptical, but something about my demeanor must have convinced them I was telling the truth. They dispatched a team to the house and found the cameras, the surveillance equipment in the attic, everything just as I described. But there was no sign of the intruder. Whoever had been watching me had vanished into the night. The homeowners, who were in Europe, swore they knew nothing about it. The investigation, they told me, would take time. Meanwhile, I was left to pick up the pieces of my shattered sense of security. I moved in with a friend, unable to bear the thought of being alone. Every unexpected noise made me jump, every flicker of light made me flinch. Sleep became a luxury I rarely afforded. But the worst part was the gnawing question that haunted my every waking moment. Why me? What made me the target of such an elaborate scheme? Were they still out there, watching, waiting for another opportunity? I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The world feels darker now, filled with hidden dangers and invisible eyes. But I survived. I escaped. And whatever comes next, I'll face it head on. After all, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? I just hope I never have to test that theory again. An unexpected nightmare in the forest. The woods were supposed to be my escape, a chance to clear my mind and reconnect with nature. Instead, they became a nightmare that would haunt me for years. I never imagined that a simple camping trip could turn into a fight for survival against an invisible enemy lurking among the trees. It all began innocently enough. For months I'd been stressed at work, burning the candle at both ends with long hours and endless deadlines. A project that seemed endless. When I finally completed it, I knew I needed to disconnect. The idea of a solo camping trip in the Cascade Mountains felt perfect. Just me, my tent, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had camped many times before, but always with friends or in organized groups. This would be my first time truly alone. The idea was both thrilling and a bit intimidating. I chose a remote location, about a day's hike from the nearest trailhead. It was early autumn, and the leaves were starting to change, painting the forest in vivid shades of red and gold. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and wild herbs. The hike-in was peaceful, though more challenging than I had anticipated. By the time I reached my chosen spot, a small clearing near a bubbling stream, my muscles ached pleasantly from the effort. I set up camp, lit a small fire, and sat down to watch the sunset, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. That first night passed peacefully. I slept better than I had in weeks, lulled by the soft sounds of the forest. The next morning, I woke early, eager to explore the area. I spent the day hiking, taking photos, and simply soaking in the tranquility of nature. It was exactly what I needed, a complete disconnection from the chaos of daily life. As evening approached, I returned to camp, looking forward to another night under the stars. That's when the trouble began. As I approached my camp, I noticed something strange. The air smelled different. There was a sharp, almost chemical tang that didn't belong in the middle of the forest. I stopped, suddenly alert. The forest was quieter than it should have been. The usual chorus of birds and insects was eerily absent. A sense of unease started to creep over me. Moving cautiously, I scanned the trees for any signs of disturbance. At first glance, everything appeared normal. My tent was intact, my gear untouched. But then I saw them. Fresh footprints in the soft earth near my fire pit. They weren't mine. My heart began to pound. Someone had been at my campsite while I was away. But who? And why? I was debating whether to pack up and leave when I heard voices in the distance. They were faint but growing closer. Without thinking, I ducked behind a fallen log, peering through the underbrush. Two men emerged from the trees on the other side of the clearing. They were dressed in dark clothing, heavy boots, and gloves. Each carried a large duffel bag. They moved with precision, like they were familiar with the terrain. "This spot works," one said, dropping his bag with a metallic clatter. "Far enough off the main trails but still accessible." The other man nodded, scanning the area with a sharp gaze. His eyes swept over my hidden position, and I held my breath, willing myself to become invisible. "Let's set it up," he said. "We need to be operational before nightfall." They began unpacking their bags, and my blood froze the moment I saw what was before me. Large chemical drums, test tubes, hot plates, every component of a mobile drug lab was spread out in plain sight. I had stumbled upon a methamphetamine manufacturing operation in the heart of a national forest. I knew I needed to get out of there and find help, but I was trapped. Any movement could give away my position, and I had no doubt that these men would do whatever it took to eliminate a witness. So I stayed put, barely breathing, as I watched them set up their lab. The sharp, acrid smell of chemicals grew stronger, stinging my nostrils and making my eyes water. I observed as they mixed ingredients with terrifying precision. This was no amateur operation. It was a highly professional setup. Hours slipped by, the sun began to set, and long shadows stretched across the clearing. My body was stiff from staying completely still, my muscles screaming for relief, but fear kept me frozen in place. As darkness fell completely, more men arrived. I counted 5 in total, each exuding an air of danger. They spoke in hushed tones, discussing distribution routes and meeting points. It became clear that I was overhearing the logistics of a significant drug trafficking network. I tried to shift my legs slightly to relieve a painful cramp that had formed. It was a mistake. A twig snapped under my weight, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. Every man in the clearing stopped what they were doing. "What was that?" one of them asked, his hand moving to his waist where I could make out the silhouette of a pistol. "Probably just an animal," another replied, though his voice carried an edge of doubt. "Check it out," the first man ordered. "We can't take any chances." 2 of them began walking in my direction, their flashlights sweeping through the underbrush. I knew I couldn't stay hidden much longer. It was only a matter of time before they found me. I had to move. Taking a deep breath, I bolted from my hiding spot, sprinting towards the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. Shouts erupted behind me, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps giving chase. I ran blindly through the forest, branches slapping against my face and roots threatening to trip me with every step. The men behind me were closing in. I could hear their footsteps growing louder. They knew this terrain better than I did, and they weren't as exhausted. A gunshot rang out, shattering the silence of the forest. The bullet whizzed past my ear, embedding itself in a tree nearby. The sound jolted me, pushing me to run faster, fear pumping adrenaline through my veins. I had no plan, no destination, just a single thought: put as much distance as possible between myself and those men. But I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I needed to find a place to hide, to lose them. Up ahead, the ground began to slope downward. The sound of rushing water reached my ears. It had to be the stream where I had camped. But farther ahead, if it was wide enough, maybe I could use it to throw my pursuers off my trail. I ran in that direction, my body pushed to its limits. The shouts of the men echoed behind me, growing louder, closer. Another gunshot rang out, this time nearer, followed by the sharp sound of impact against the rocks. At last, the trees opened up, and I found myself at the edge of a cliff. Below, about 30 feet down, was the river. Swollen by recent rains, it roared with a ferocity that matched my desperation. By the pale moonlight, I could see the churning waters but had no time to hesitate. Just as another shot cracked behind me, I jumped. The air seemed to freeze as I fell. Then I hit the water hard, the impact knocking all the air from my lungs. The icy current seized me immediately, hurling me against rocks and debris. The relentless force of the river overwhelmed me, but I let it carry me, knowing my pursuers wouldn't be able to follow easily in such conditions. I don't know how long I was in the river, minutes, perhaps hours. Eventually, the current began to calm, and I managed to drag myself to the shore. Exhausted and trembling from the cold, I collapsed onto the rocky bank, unable to move from the pain and sheer fatigue. When I finally found the strength to sit up, I realized I had no idea where I was. My clothes were soaked, I had no supplies, and I was utterly lost in the wilderness. But I was alive, and at that moment, that was all that mattered. For the next 2 days, I followed the river, searching for any sign of civilization. I survived on berries I recognized as safe to eat and drank from the river. Sleep was fleeting, haunted by the constant fear that the men were still hunting me. On the 3rd day, I stumbled upon a hiking trail. I followed it until I reached a ranger station. When I arrived, I collapsed at the doorstep. The rangers were shocked as they listened to my story. They immediately contacted the police and the DA. A massive search operation was launched, but by the time they reached the location I had described, the clandestine lab was gone. They found traces, abandoned chemical containers, trampled vegetation, but the men had vanished. In the months that followed, I gave countless statements to the authorities. My information helped dismantle parts of a drug trafficking network operating in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Several arrests were made, but the men I encountered that night were never found. I still go camping, but never alone. The forest, once my sanctuary, now carries a darker edge. Every crack of a branch, every unexpected shadow sets my heart racing. Logically, I know the odds of running into those men again are slim, but logic holds little sway over the memories of that harrowing night. Sometimes, in my dreams, I'm still running through those dark woods, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. I wake up gasping for air, tangled in my sheets, with the phantom smell of chemicals lingering in my nose. They say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I'm not sure I believe that anymore. But I do know this: I survived. And every day since has been a gift I don't take for granted. The forest taught me a harsh lesson about the darkness that can lurk in the most beautiful places. But it also revealed a strength within me I never knew I had. And so, at least, I'm grateful for that. From the moment I saw his thumb sticking out through the frayed sleeve of his jacket, I knew I should have kept driving. But the rain was pouring down in sheets, and something in his eyes made me stop. That decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was just past midnight, and I was heading home after a late shift at the hospital. The highway stretched ahead of me, empty and dark, visibility reduced to just a few meters in front of my headlights. I was exhausted, the kind of deep weariness that comes from being on your feet for 12 hours straight, dealing with other people's emergencies. Maybe that's why I hadn't noticed the hitchhiker earlier. I saw him standing on the shoulder, his figure barely visible through the downpour. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his lean frame. As I slowed down, he turned to face me, his features illuminated by the headlights. "Just a bit further," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "My car broke down, and I'm trying to get to the next town. I'd really appreciate a ride." I hesitated for a moment. Every instinct told me to keep driving, to leave the stranger behind in my rearview mirror. But the rain showed no signs of letting up, and I couldn't bring myself to abandon someone in weather like this. "Get in," I said, unlocking the door. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing with him the smell of wet clothes and something else I couldn't quite place. "Thanks, man," he said, flashing me a grateful smile. "You're a lifesaver." I merged back onto the highway, the wipers working overtime against the deluge. "I'm Mark," I offered, trying to dispel the awkward silence settling between us. "John," he replied, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Really, I appreciate this. Not many people would stop on a night like this." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the rhythmic swish of the wipers the only sound. I stole furtive glances at John when I could. He was younger than I had initially thought, probably around 25. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was an almost boyish quality to his face. "So, what happened to your car?" I asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. John shrugged. "Old clunker finally gave out. I was hoping to make it to my sister's place." He trailed off, staring out the window into the rain-slicked darkness. Something about his story didn't quite add up, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I chalked it up to my exhaustion and focused on the road ahead. We had been driving for about 20 minutes when John spoke again. "Do you mind taking a little detour? There's an exit up ahead that'll get us there faster." I frowned. "I thought you said you were headed to the next town." "Yeah," he replied. "My sister lives just outside of it. This way's quicker, trust me. Against my better judgment, I took the exit he indicated. The road narrowed, winding through a dense forest. The rain, if anything, seemed to intensify. You're sure this is the right way? I asked, anxiety starting to gnaw at the edges of my mind. John nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Just a little further. We continued driving, the trees on either side pressing in closer. I was about to suggest turning back when John suddenly said, "Stop here." I slowed down, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. There was nothing ahead but trees and darkness. There was nothing here. The words died in my throat as I felt something cold and hard pressing against my ribs. I turned slowly to see John holding a knife, all traces of his previous kindness gone. "Turn off the engine and hand me the keys," he said, his voice low and dangerous. My heart pounded so loudly that I was sure he could hear it over the rain. With trembling hands I did as he said. "Now, get out of the car." Slowly. I opened the door, the sound of the rain intensifying as I stepped into the downpour. John followed, keeping the knife pointed at me. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. He smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile he had given me before. It was the smile of a predator. "Everything you've got, for starters, wallet, phone, watch. Then we're going to take a little walk." I handed over my belongings, my mind racing. We were miles from anywhere, in the middle of a storm. Even if I could overpower him, where would I go? John gestured toward the trees with the knife. "Start walking." I stumbled forward, barely able to navigate through the underbrush. Branches whipped my face, mud clung to my shoes, and the rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, leaving me shivering and miserable. John stayed close behind, occasionally prodding me with the knife to keep me moving. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we emerged into a small clearing. At its center stood a dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. "Inside," John ordered, giving me a sharp push toward the door. The interior of the cabin was damp and moldy, with peeling wallpaper and decrepit furniture. A battery-powered lantern sat on a rickety table, casting eerie shadows around the room. "Sit," John said, pointing to a chair in the corner. I sank into it as he pulled a length of rope from a backpack I hadn't noticed before. "Hands behind your back." As he tied me to the chair, I finally found my voice again. "Why are you doing this?" John finished the knot and stepped back, his cold eyes studying me. "Why does anyone do anything? Money, power, survival, take your pick." He began pacing the small room, spinning the knife between his fingers with unsettling ease. "You see, Mark, yes, that's your name, right? I've learned that people like you, good Samaritans, are the easiest to trick. You're so eager to help, so trusting. Makes my job a whole lot simpler." "Your job?" I asked, a chill running down my spine that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. He smiled that predatory smile again, the kind that made my stomach churn. "Yes, my job. Situations like this don't happen by chance, Mark. What are you going to do with me?" I managed, my voice trembling. John shrugged, leaning against the wall as he continued to twirl the knife. "That depends on you, really. See, I've got a little system worked out. First, we're going to call your bank. You'll transfer every penny you have into an account I control. Then we'll move on to your credit cards and loans, anything we can squeeze out of you." He paused, his cold gaze locking onto mine. It was a look that froze my blood. "And after?" He left the question hanging in the air, the threat as clear as day. A lump formed in my throat as I grasped the gravity of the situation. This man wasn't just intent on ruining me financially. My very survival was at stake. There was no way out, at least not yet. As if reading my thoughts, John let out a low, chilling laugh and sinister why. "Don't even think about playing the hero. Even if you manage to free yourself, which you won't, we're miles from anywhere. You'd never make it out of this forest alive. He turned away, rummaging through the bag he'd brought. I seized the moment to test the ropes binding my hands, but they were too tight. There was no easy escape. Well, he finally said, turning back with my phone in his hand. Let's get started, shall we? Now, give me your bank information. What followed was a nightmare. Endless phone calls made under the constant threat of his knife. I watched helplessly as all my savings vanished, my credit cards were maxed out, and loans were taken out in my name. With every transaction, it felt like a piece of my future was being erased. By the time he was done, I was physically and emotionally drained. John, however, seemed utterly pleased with himself. He hummed cheerfully as he packed away papers and my now-dead phone. Well, Mark, I've got to say, you've been quite the role model, he said, almost as if we were having a casual conversation. It almost makes me feel bad about what comes next. He approached me with the knife, and for a moment, I was certain this was the end. But instead of cutting me, he sliced through the ropes binding me to the chair. Remember what I said about choices? He asked, stepping back. Well, here's yours. That door leads to the forest. If you're lucky, you might find your way back to civilization. He gestured toward the knife now resting on the table. Or you can try to fight your way out. But I wouldn't recommend it. With that, he grabbed his bag, walked to the door, and added, Oh, and Mark, if I were you, I'd wait at least an hour before heading out. Just in case. Then he was gone. I was left alone in the cabin with nothing but the sound of rain and the crushing weight of what had just happened. I don't know how long I sat there, stunned and trembling. When I finally mustered the strength to move, I stumbled, feeling the weight of his parting words. Men like John, they said, are experts at vanishing. Months have passed, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. My credit is ruined, my savings gone. I jump at every shadow and distrust every act of kindness. But I'm alive, and little by little, I'm rebuilding my life. If there's one thing I learned that night, it's this: sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who look like ordinary people. The memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm home alone or driving at night, I feel that same tension in the air, as if something is wrong, even when it isn't. There are nights I wake up drenched in sweat, reliving the moment John pointed the knife at me or the crunch of branches under my feet as he led me into that dark forest. I haven't offered anyone a ride since. I can't even imagine stopping to help a stranger on the road. What used to feel like a simple act of kindness now feels like a potential death sentence. The police continued their investigation for weeks after the incident but found no trace of John or my car. The officers assured me they were doing everything they could, but their expressions told me otherwise. John was, as they put it, a ghost. I tried to rebuild what I could. I changed all my bank accounts and reported the fraud to the credit card companies, but I signed up for identity protection services, but the deepest scars aren't financial, they're etched into my mind. Every time my phone rings from an unknown number, I tense up. Every time I hear footsteps behind me on the street, my heart races uncontrollably. Even at home, I lock every door and window, a precaution I never even considered necessary before. What unsettles me the most is John. He didn't seem desperate or unprepared. He was methodical, calculating, and everything about his behavior suggested that this wasn't his first time. His system, as he called it, had likely ruined other lives before mine. And though I made it out alive, I can't shake the thought that someday he might cross my path again. There are nights when I replay it all in my head. What could have happened if I had chosen to stay seated in that cabin or tried to fight back with the knife on the table? But then I remember his smile, that predatory smile that made it clear he had thought of everything. Any resistance would have only made things worse. I survived because I played his game, stayed just compliant enough not to provoke him into doing something even more dangerous. Fear is a strange thing. It can paralyze you, but sometimes It's what keeps you alive. That night, fear saved me. But now, it's a constant shadow that never fully disappears. Whenever I think I'm moving past it, something small, a man standing too long in a dark corner, a car that seems to follow me for just a bit too long, snaps me back to that cabin, back to that moment of pure helplessness. For now, I'm trying to live one day at a time. I've learned to be more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I no longer take my safety for granted. Yet I refuse to let fear consume me entirely. I know I'll never be the same person I was before that night, but I also know that I'm alive, and that's something I won't let him take away from me. Still, one question haunts me: what if he finds me again? That uncertainty, that possibility, is what keeps me on edge. Because at the end of the day, the real danger doesn't lie in the monsters we imagine under our beds. It's in the human predators hiding in plain sight. The moment I moved that old painting and saw the tiny red light blinking, I knew my life would never be the same. What I thought was a charming fixer-upper was about to become my personal house of horrors. I had always dreamed of owning my own home, a place to put down roots, make my mark. So when I came across the listing for the old Victorian house on Maple Street, it felt too good to be true. The price was shockingly low for the area, and while the house clearly needed some repairs, its structure was solid. The realtor, a cheerful woman named Karen, seemed almost too eager to close the deal. Looking back, I should have seen it as a red flag. But I was blinded by the excitement of finally having a place to call my own. Move-in day was a whirlwind of boxes, furniture, and endless plans for how I would make this house my home. Little did I know, it would soon become the setting for my worst nightmare. I had big, exciting plans for all the renovations I wanted to make. Everything seemed perfect until that night when, while hanging a mirror in the hallway, I noticed something behind one of the old paintings left by the previous owner. Driven by curiosity, I decided to move the painting from the wall, and to my surprise I found myself staring at a small, blinking red light. At first I thought it might be some outdated security system, but as I looked closer, a creeping sense of unease began to settle in. It was a camera. A very small and modern camera. With my heart racing, I started searching the rest of the house. In the living room, I found another hidden camera tucked away in a ventilation grate. In the kitchen, there was one cleverly concealed behind the microwave. Even in the bathroom, I discovered a tiny lens hidden behind the mirror. By the time I finished my search, I had uncovered at least 12 hidden cameras scattered throughout the house. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been watching me. Given the locations of some of these cameras, they had been witnessing very intimate moments. I felt violated, exposed, and terrified. Who had installed these cameras? Was it the previous owner, the real estate agent, or someone completely different? My hands shaking, I called the police. They arrived quickly, and I showed them each camera I had found. The officers, with serious faces, began documenting everything. They told me they would need to bring in a specialist to remove the cameras and analyze them for any clues about who could have installed them. As they worked, I sat on the front porch, trying to process what was happening. The house that had just hours earlier felt full of promise now felt tainted, unsafe. I couldn't stop thinking about everything I had done since moving in, all those private moments that could have been captured and watched by who knows who. By the time the police had finished their initial investigation, it was around midnight. They advised me not to spend the night in the house while they continued to process the evidence. Numbly, I nodded, grabbed some clothes, and headed to a nearby hotel. That night I barely slept. My mind kept spinning with questions and fears. Who had been watching me? What did they want? And the most terrifying thought of all, were they still out there? The next morning, I met with a detective at the police station. She was a serious woman with kind eyes that contrasted with her professional demeanor. "Miss Johnson," she began, "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. The situation is serious. The cameras we found in your house are high-end, and they were installed professionally. This wasn't the work of an amateur. I felt my stomach drop. Do you know who did this? I asked, dreading the answer. Detective Rodriguez shook her head. Not yet, but we're investigating. We've reviewed the property records, and we're looking into everyone who's had access to the house over the past few years. Previous owners, real estate agents, maintenance workers. She paused and looked at me seriously. In the meantime, I need to ask, could there be someone who might want to spy on you? An ex, someone you've had issues with? I shook my head, feeling a bit offended by the suggestion. No, nothing like that. Honestly, I can't imagine why anyone would want to watch me. Rodriguez nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. All right, we'll keep investigating. We've removed all the cameras we found, and we will send a team to conduct another inspection, just to make sure we haven't missed anything. But Miss Johnson, I have to be honest with you, your house is now a crime scene. It could be some time before you can return. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and despair. On one hand, I couldn't imagine going back to that house, knowing what had happened there. On the other hand, it was my home, and according to the timestamp on the most recent files, it still was. I slammed my laptop shut, my heart hammering in my chest. I thought finding answers would help, but instead, I felt more terrified than ever. The violation of my privacy wasn't limited to the house, it had spread to every aspect of my life. As I sat there, trying to decide what to do next, my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. Hands trembling, I opened it. It was simple, but enough to freeze me to my bones. Enjoying the house, Sarah? Don't worry, I'm still watching, always watching. In that moment, I realized that this nightmare was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. The first call came at 5:17 a.m. I remember it because I was staring at the clock, wishing the hands would move faster, counting the minutes until my shift would be over. I should have never answered, but I did. And that's when the nightmare began. My name is Alex, and I work the midnight shift at WKRP, a small radio station in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. Usually, it's an easy job. I play music, take a few requests, and try not to fall asleep most nights. The hardest part is staying awake. But tonight wasn't just any night. It all started as usual. I arrived around midnight, relieved the afternoon DJ, and settled in for 6 hours of classic rock and the occasional listener request. The studio is small, a soundboard, a couple of monitors, and a window that looks out into the empty station. It's not much, but it's my domain, from midnight to 6. The first hours passed without incident. I played my usual mix of Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, and Bob Seger, sprinkled with a few local ads and weather updates. It was a quiet night, even by our standards. No calls, no requests, just me and the music. Then, at 1:01 a.m., the request line lit up. I answered with my usual greeting. You're live on WKRP. What can I play for you tonight? Silence. Just as I was about to hang up, thinking it was a prank, I heard slow, deliberate breathing on the other end of the line. Hello? I said, feeling awkward. Is anyone there? Put something on for me, said a low male voice, almost a whisper, with an eerie quality I couldn't quite place. Sure, I replied, trying to sound cheerful. What would you like to hear? Surprise me, he said, and then the line went dead. I let it slide. Nighttime listeners can be a little odd sometimes, and this wasn't the strangest request I'd gotten. I queued up Hotel California by the Eagles and went back to scrolling through my phone. 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same number. WKRK, what can I do for you? I answered. You have good taste, said the voice. It was the same man. I was sure of it. What else can you put on for me? A chill ran down my spine. There was something about his tone that unsettled me. Sure. I replied, trying to stay calm. Any preferences? I trust your judgment, he said. I hung up again, but this time, I was really starting to get nervous. I stared out the window, hoping to see someone in the parking lot, but it was empty, except for the eerie glow of a flickering street lamp casting long shadows. I turned on Stairway to Heaven, more to calm myself down than for any other reason. As the last notes faded away, the phone rang again. I froze, staring at it, unsure what to do. Part of me wanted to just ignore it, let it ring until whoever was calling gave up. But deep down, I knew I couldn't do that. My job was to answer, even if I was terrified. WKRP, I said, my voice trembling slightly. I can see why people listen to you. The man's voice came through, and this time, it had a sharper, more menacing edge. The way you pick songs, the way you speak, it's captivating. My blood ran cold. Who are you? I demanded, my heart pounding. The man let out a soft laugh, a sound that made my skin crawl. Just a fan, Alex. A very dedicated fan. My name. How did he know my name? We never used our real names on the air. My DJ nickname was the Night Owl. Look, I said, trying to steady myself. I don't know who you are, and I don't care. But this isn't funny. Please don't call again. Oh, I'll call again, he replied, his voice calm but chilling. I'm closer than you think, Alex. I'm watching you. The line went dead. My hands shook as I set the receiver down, my eyes scanning the small studio. Suddenly, it felt like I was completely exposed. The windows, which usually made the place feel less claustrophobic, now felt like gaping vulnerabilities. Anyone could be outside, watching, and I wouldn't even know. I tried to convince myself it was just some crazy person trying to spook me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next hour passed in a blur of paranoia. I jumped at every noise, stared out the window at every shadow. The phone stayed silent, which somehow felt worse. The anticipation was unbearable. At 3:02 a.m., it rang again. I answered without saying a word. You should be more careful, Alex, the voice said. This time, it was calm, almost soothing, which made it even more terrifying. You never know who might be listening, or watching. What do you want? I whispered, my throat dry. Let's play a game, he said. It's simple. I'll give you a choice of songs to play. If you pick the right one, nothing happens. But if you pick wrong, well, let's just say the consequences won't be pleasant. My mind was in chaos. This couldn't be happening. Stuff like this only happens in movies or books, right? But the fear I felt was all too real. I'm hanging up now, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm calling the police. You won't do that if you want your sister to stay safe, he said, his tone suddenly icy. My heart stopped. What did you say? I asked, barely able to breathe. Sarah, right? She lives on Elm Street, in that cute little house with the blue shutters. It would be such a shame if something happened to her. Panic washed over me. How did he know that? How did he know about Sarah? How did he know where she lived? Leave her out of this, I choked out. That's up to you, Alex, the voice said. Play the game, and everyone stays safe. Refuse and, well, I think you understand. I knew it could be a bluff. Maybe he had no idea who Sarah was, just saying things to scare me. But what if it wasn't a bluff? Could I take that risk? Fine, I said, defeated. I'll play. Excellent, he said, almost gleeful. Let's get started. Easy one. Sympathy for the Devil or House of the Rising Sun? My mind raced. Was there a right answer? Was he looking for something specific, or was this just part of his sick game? House of the Rising Sun, I whispered, my voice barely audible. There was a pause that felt like an eternity. Good choice, he said finally. Play it now. With trembling hands, I searched for the song, my heart hammering in my chest, the oppressive silence around me making every moment feel like I was teetering on the edge of something far worse than I could imagine. As the first notes filled the air, I realized I had been holding my breath the entire time. "You're a natural at this game," Alex's voice said when I answered again. "Let's try another." And so it went for the next 2 hours. He would call, give me a song choice, and I had to pick. Sometimes he would offer cryptic clues, other times it seemed completely random. All the while, I was painfully aware that a single mistake could lead to disaster. As the clock edged toward 5 a.m., I was a bundle of nerves. My shirt was soaked with sweat, and my hands shook so badly I could barely control the soundboard. But somehow, I had made it this far without a single error. The line rang one final time. "You've done well," Alex's voice said. "I'm impressed. But now it's time for the final round. If you choose right, it's over. If you choose wrong, well, I think you know what happens." I swallowed hard. "What's the choice?" "Don't fear the Reaper," he said. "Stairway to Heaven. Choose wisely." I froze. Both songs were about death in some way. Was that the connection, or was I overthinking it? My mind raced, searching for any hidden meaning, any clue I might have missed. But deep down, I knew there was no way to know what the right answer was. In the end, I trusted my instincts. "Stairway to Heaven," I said, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, feel the cold sweat running down my back. Finally, Alex spoke. "Congratulations. You've won the game." Relief washed over me so intensely it almost hurt. "It's over?" I asked, barely believing it. "For now," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "You've proven yourself a worthy opponent. I look forward to our next game." The line went dead, and I was left there, dazed, as the first rays of dawn filtered through the window. The night had ended, but I knew the nightmare was far from over. Whoever this man was, whatever game he was playing, I had the feeling this was just the beginning. When the morning DJ arrived, I practically ran to my car, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I called Sarah as soon as I got home, relieved to hear her sleepy voice on the other end. She was fine, completely unaware of what had happened the night before. I didn't tell her. How could I? It all felt so unreal in the light of day. But as I crawled into bed, exhausted and jittery, I knew one thing for sure. I would never feel truly safe in that radio booth again. Somewhere out there, a man with a chilling voice was waiting, planning his next move in a game I never agreed to play. The moment his headlights filled my rearview mirror, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary trip. What I didn't know was that those blinding headlights would lead me down a path of terror I never imagined, outside of a nightmare. It was supposed to be a simple road trip, just me, my old Honda Civic, and 300 miles of highway between my city and my sister's wedding. I'd made this trip a dozen times before, always choosing the scenic route through the mountains instead of the busy highway. The views were breathtaking, and the solitude was a welcome break from my hectic city life. I left late, around 9 p.m., thinking I would drive through the night. It would be just in time for the rehearsal dinner. The first few hours passed without incident. The radio kept me company as I navigated the dark, winding roads, my headlights cutting through the pitch-black forest on either side of me. Around midnight, I noticed the car behind me for the first time. At first, I didn't think much of it. Even though this road wasn't very busy, it wasn't unusual to see other drivers, even at this late hour. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to notice something strange. They weren't trying to pass me, nor were they falling behind. They maintained a constant distance, just close enough for their headlights to bathe my car in a searing light. I squinted, trying to make out the vehicle in my rearview mirror. It seemed to be a large truck, but the bright glare made it hard to distinguish details. A sense of unease began to settle in my chest. Why were they following me so closely? There was plenty of room to pass on this stretch of road. I eased off the gas, letting my car slow down. If they wanted to pass, now was their chance. But they slowed down too, maintaining the same distance. My heart began to race. This wasn't normal. I pressed the gas pedal harder, forcing my old Civic to accelerate faster than I felt comfortable with on these twisty mountain curves. The truck matched my pace effortlessly. Then I saw it. A second set of headlights appeared behind the first vehicle. Another car had joined the chase. Now 2 vehicles were tailing me closely. My hands started to sweat as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. This couldn't be a coincidence. 2 vehicles, working together to follow me, out here in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night. Trying to stay calm, I checked my phone. No service. Of course, these mountain roads were notorious for lacking coverage. Suddenly, the truck behind me flashed its high beams on and off 3 times in quick succession, and then, a sound that froze my blood. A long, screeching truck horn. It wasn't a greeting or a warning, it was a signal. The second vehicle, now clearly visible as an SUV, sped up and pulled alongside me, matching my speed. I glanced quickly at the tinted windows, but I couldn't see who was inside. Without warning, the SUV swerved toward me, trying to ram me off the road. I screamed and jerked the wheel, narrowly avoiding the collision. My tires screamed as I fought to maintain control. They were trying to push me off the road. This wasn't just harassment anymore. These people, whoever they were, intended to hurt me. I floored the accelerator, pushing my old Civic to its limits. The speed climbed rapidly, 80, 90, 100 miles per hour. Driving that fast on these roads was insane, but my survival instinct was in overdrive. The truck and the SUV didn't fall behind. Now, they were trying to box me in, one on each side, forcing me to slow down or risk a fatal crash. Up ahead I saw a turnoff, a narrow, unmarked path leading into the darkness. There was no time to think. I yanked the wheel sharply, my brakes screeching as I took the turn. I heard the roar of the engines behind me, the chase continuing, but they were in larger vehicles, unable to navigate the curve at my speed. Now on the dirt road, my car bounced and shuddered, branches slapping the windows. I dared not slow down. I knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up. I took random turns, with no idea where I was headed. My only goal was to buy time. Finally, the sound of the engines behind me began to fade. I stopped on a narrow road, my car panting like it was alive. The silence of the forest closed in around me, but it wasn't comforting. My heart was still pounding hard in my chest, and I knew I wasn't safe yet. And every shadow seemed to shift. I moved slowly along the path, hoping to spot any signs of civilization in the distance. Then I saw it, a light, a spark of hope. I moved closer, thinking I had found a house or a gas station. But as I neared it, a cold dread washed over me. It wasn't a house, it was a camp. A small fire burned brightly in the center of a clearing, and there, beside it, was a solitary figure, an older man with a graying beard. Cautious but desperate, I stepped out of my car and approached the fire. The man looked up. His face, weathered and full of worry, was a map of years lived in silence and solitude. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked in a gravelly voice. My voice cracked as I began to explain everything: the cars, the chase, the fear that still gripped my body like a vice. The man listened quietly, nodding slowly. When I finished, he let out a heavy sigh. "You're not the first to say something like that," he said, tossing another branch into the fire. "These mountains have a reputation. Cars that vanish. People last seen on this road. And no one does a thing about it." I asked if I could use his phone, but he didn't have one. Instead, he offered me a place by the fire until dawn. That night, every sound in the forest made me jump. Every time the firelight flickered, I braced myself, expecting to see those headlights getting closer. As dawn broke, he gave me directions to the main road. When I finally reached a gas station, I called the police. They took my statement, but it was clear there wasn't much they could do without license plates or detailed descriptions of the drivers. There was nothing to investigate. I returned to the road, this time taking the freeway. But every car behind me set my nerves on edge. Since that day, I haven't taken that route again. Now I avoid driving at night because I've learned a truth I'll never forget. Sometimes, the monsters don't hide in the dark. They're out there, behind the bright headlights, waiting. And if you ever feel like you're being watched on the road, if a car seems to be following you too closely, don't ignore it. It could be the difference between making it home or never making it at all. The moment I saw the unmarked boxes being loaded onto that plane, I knew I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. What I hadn't imagined was that my night shift at the airport would soon turn into a fight for my life. I had been working the night shift at Millbrook International Airport for a few months. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and I liked the quiet of the airport at night. Most of the time, it was just me, a handful of security guards, and the occasional flight crew for some late-night flights. That night started like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., greeted Frank in security, and began my rounds in the cargo area. Everything was routine, until 2 a.m., when I heard the unmistakable sound of a plane taxiing. That was strange. There were no scheduled flights at that hour, and unscheduled landings usually came with a considerable amount of noise and commotion. But this plane arrived silently, almost stealthily. Curiosity got the better of me, and I made my way to the window that overlooked the tarmac, staying hidden in the shadows. It was a cargo plane, no markings, no visible airline insignia. As I watched, a group of men emerged from a hangar I had always thought was empty. They were dressed in dark clothes and moved with unsettling precision. The cargo hold of the plane opened, and the men began unloading large wooden crates, every single one of them unmarked. My heart started to race. This wasn't normal cargo handling. Every package that passed through this airport was supposed to be registered, tagged, and tracked. These crates weren't following any of those rules. As I looked at these boxes, they were anonymous, invisible to the system. But the moment I saw the blood-stained tent, I knew my peaceful hiking trip had turned into a nightmare. What I didn't know yet was that I was about to become the prey in a twisted game of survival. It had been a weekend I'd been planning for months, a solo trip, just me and nature. As an experienced hiker, I wasn't worried about the solitude. In fact, I craved it. I had carefully mapped out my route through the Cascade Mountains, eagerly anticipating days of peace, far away from the noise of the world. The first day went exactly as planned. I covered great ground, the weather was perfect, and the landscapes were breathtaking. As the afternoon turned into evening, I stumbled upon the perfect clearing to set up camp. After enjoying a freeze-dried meal, I decided to take a short night walk before getting into my sleeping bag. That's when I saw it. About 400 meters from my camp, partially hidden by trees, there was another tent. At first, I didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual to encounter other hikers, even this far off the beaten path. But as I got closer, something felt wrong. The tent was destroyed. One side had collapsed, the fabric was torn, and unmistakable dark stains, blood, marred the green material. My heart began to race. I called out, hoping for a response, but only silence greeted me. Cautiously, I moved closer. A trail of blood led into the tent. Taking a deep breath, I pulled aside the entrance and looked inside. The sight was horrifying. Sleeping bags were shredded, gear was scattered all over, and more blood stained the floor. But there was no body. No sign of who had been there. Then I noticed something chilling. There were human footprints. They led from the tent into the dense forest. But they weren't erratic or staggering, as you'd expect from someone who had been hurt. No, they were steady, deliberate, as though the person had walked calmly away from the scene. A shiver ran down my spine. This wasn't an accident. Something far darker was at play here. Panicking, I turned and ran back to my camp with a single thought in mind: pack up and get out of there as fast as possible. But as I was tearing down my tent, something in the trees caught my eye. About 50 meters away, half hidden behind a tree, a figure was watching me. For a split second, our eyes locked. Then, before I could even process what I was seeing, the figure disappeared between the trees, moving with a speed that seemed unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest as panic took over. I shoved the rest of my belongings into my pack and began running, no time to find the trail. I just plowed through the forest, getting as far from the camp as I could. Behind me, I could hear something moving, snapping branches and leaves. My pursuer wasn't trying to be stealthy. My legs burned, my breath was ragged, but I couldn't stop. I knew that if I did, I might never get up again. After what felt like hours, I stumbled down a slope and tumbled to the bottom, my body crashing into roots and rocks. I lay there, breathless and dazed, staring at the cold ground as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. My heart raced, but the moment I forced myself to stand, I realized something terrifying. I had lost my backpack during the fall. All of my gear, my map, my emergency radio, everything was gone. I was completely alone, stranded in a dense forest, with no idea how to get out. And worse, something, or someone, was following me, and it wasn't friendly. As I tried to regain my bearings, I heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps. But this time, they were coming closer, slow and deliberate, as though they were toying with me, stretching out my fear like a cat playing with a mouse before delivering the final strike. I moved cautiously, each step chosen with care to avoid making any noise, but it was impossible to be silent. The crack of each dry branch and the rustle of leaves sent my heart into a frenzy. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to shift. And then, off in the distance, I saw it, a faint glimmer. A light. With renewed hope, I moved toward it, praying it was someone who could help. As I got closer, I saw it was a campfire. And sitting by the fire, an older man with a long gray beard, calmly smoking a pipe. "What brings you here, young lady?" the man asked, his eyes lifting from the flames to meet mine. I rushed toward him, my words tumbling out in a frantic stream. I told him everything, the bloody tent, the strange footprints, the figure chasing me. The man listened in silence, nodding gravely. "You're not the first to tell me something like this," he said finally. "These woods have a bad reputation. People vanish out here. Some say it's animals. Others, well, they say it's not something natural." I spent the rest of the night by the fire, my nerves on edge from every strange sound that came from the forest. As dawn approached, the man gave me instructions to return to a ranger station. "Remember," he warned, "the sun isn't always your friend. Whatever is out there doesn't stop just because there's light." The journey back to the ranger station was tense. Every crack of a branch, every snap of twigs had me spinning around, half expecting to see that figure emerge from the trees. When I finally arrived at the station, I reported what had happened. The rangers sent out a search party, but they found nothing. No sign of the bloody tent. No traces of anything. It was as if the whole thing had disappeared. Years later, I still have nightmares about that night. I've never gone camping alone again. And I don't look at forests the same way anymore. Because now I know, sometimes the real monsters aren't the wild animals. Sometimes they're humans. And sometimes there's something else entirely. So if you're ever in the woods, and you get that feeling, that sense that something's watching you, don't ignore it. It might just save your life. Because out there, in the depths of nature, not everyone is just enjoying the scenery. Some are hunting. And you never know when you might become their prey. The moment I saw those unmarked crates being loaded onto that plane, I knew I had stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. What I didn't expect was that my night shift at the airport would soon turn into a fight for my life. I'd been working the night shift at Millbrook International Airport for a few months. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills, and I liked the quiet of the airport at night. Most of the time, it was just me, a handful of security guards, and the occasional late-night flight crew. The occasional flight crew member from a nocturnal flight that night began like any other. I clocked in at 11 p.m., greeted Frank at security, and did my usual rounds through the cargo area. Everything was routine until around 2 a.m. when I heard the unmistakable sound of an airplane taxiing. That was unusual. No flights were scheduled for that hour, and unscheduled landings usually came with a considerable amount of noise. But this plane arrived in complete silence, almost stealthily. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved toward the window that faced the tarmac, staying in the shadows. It was a cargo plane, unmarked, with no visible airline identifiers. As I watched, a group of men emerged from a hangar I had assumed was empty. They were dressed in dark clothes and moved with a precision that sent a chill down my spine. The plane's cargo hold opened, and the men began unloading large wooden crates. None of them bore any visible markings. My heart began to race. This wasn't normal cargo handling. Every package that passed through this airport had to be logged, tagged, and tracked. These boxes were anonymous, invisible to the system. I should have walked away then. I should have listened to the voice in my head telling me to return to my rounds and forget everything. But something kept me there, watching as crate after crate was unloaded and carried into the hangar. That's when something happened that froze my blood. One of the men stumbled while carrying a crate, and it hit the ground with a loud thud. The lid of the box partially opened, and under the dim tarmac lights, something inside gleamed. It looked like the barrel of a gun. My mind raced. Guns? They were trafficking weapons through our airport? This was big, dangerous. I needed to report it. But just as I turned to leave, my elbow bumped into a metal shelf next to the window. The sound echoed in the stillness of the night like thunder on the runway. All their heads snapped toward the window where I stood. I crouched down, my heart pounding, praying they hadn't seen me. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard urgent voices, followed by footsteps heading toward the building. Panic surged through me. I had to get out of there. I stood up and ran, not caring about the noise I was making now. Behind me, I could hear shouts and the pounding of footsteps as they chased me. I sprinted out of the cargo area and into the main terminal, my mind racing with questions. Where could I go? Who could I trust? I thought about heading to security, but a terrifying thought stopped me. What if they were involved? What if the whole airport was compromised? I ducked into a maintenance closet, trying to catch my breath and think. I needed to call the police, but my phone was in my locker. There was a landline in the office, but it was on the other side of the terminal. I held my breath as I heard voices outside the closet. He can't have gone far. Find him, but do it quietly. We can't afford to draw attention. I gritted my teeth, my heart hammering in my chest, as their footsteps passed right by the door. When the sound faded away, I allowed myself to breathe again. But I knew I couldn't stay hidden for long. It was only a matter of time before they searched the area. Slowly, I opened the door. I peeked my head out. The terminal was silent and deserted. Moving quickly but cautiously, I began to make my way towards the office, using the check-in counters as cover. I was halfway there when I heard a scream. There she is! I ran, charging toward the office, ignoring the shouts and footsteps chasing me. Slamming the door behind me, I locked it with trembling hands. Grabbing the landline, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. Jade, I'm at Millbrook International Airport. I gasped. They're trafficking weapons. They're trying to. Suddenly, the door slammed open. The phone was ripped from my hand. I came face to face with a man holding a gun, his face cold and scarred. "That was very stupid," he said, his voice calm but brimming with threat. They dragged me to the hangar at gunpoint, two men holding me by the arms. Inside the hangar, I saw rows of stacked crates, enough weapons to equip a small army. A well-dressed man I hadn't seen before approached. He looked me up and down with a mix of irritation and calculation. "What do we do with her, boss?" one of the men holding me asked. The well-dressed man sighed, his eyes narrowing. "This complicates things. We can't have loose ends, but if one disappears from the airport, it'll raise suspicions." He turned toward me. "What's your name?" "Sarah," I murmured, barely audible. "Well, Sarah, you've really gotten us into a bind," he said, his voice low. "I suppose I could convince you to forget everything you've seen tonight, right?" I didn't respond, too terrified to speak. "I thought so," he said, nodding slowly. Before he could give any further orders, the sound of sirens in the distance filled the air. Everyone in the hangar froze. "Impossible!" the man with the gun growled. We cut the call before he could provide more details. The well-dressed man squinted at me, a mix of respect and irritation in his eyes. "Seems like our friend Sarah is smarter than we thought," he said. He turned to the other men. "Pack everything up fast. Don't leave anything behind." In the chaos that followed, they bound my hands with tape and locked me in a closet inside the office, barricading the door with something heavy. From inside, I could hear the roar of airplane engines as they took off. When the police finally found me, the hangar was empty. The weapons were gone, and so were the men. A detective explained to me later. "This goes deep. We've received calls from some very important people telling us to drop the case. They offered me protection, even a new identity. But I knew my life would never be the same. Now, years later, I'm still moving from place to place, always looking over my shoulder. Because once you see the dark, hidden workings of the world, you can never unsee it. The moment I opened the package and saw what was inside, I knew my life would never be the same again. What I had expected to be a routine delivery turned into something that pulled me into a dark and dangerous mystery I couldn't ignore. It was a quiet afternoon when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting any packages, but there it was, a plain cardboard box on my porch. No return address, just my name and address scribbled in hasty handwriting. I thought maybe it was a mistake, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the box on my dining table. Inside, there was a thick brown envelope and an object wrapped in dark cloth. I first reached for the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with a message written in bold, capitalized letters. "Do not call the police. What you do with this is up to you. They're watching." My pulse quickened. I looked out the window, half expecting something out of the ordinary. But the street was empty. I decided to unwrap the object. Inside was a small, weathered leather notebook. I carefully opened it, and my eyes fell on disturbing drawings. Humanoid figures with elongated limbs, surrounded by symbols I didn't recognize. On the first pages, there were notes, written in small, spidery handwriting. "I'm terrified. They're coming for all of us. They found me, and time is running out." The notebook was filled with diagrams, dates, and locations, but nothing made sense. It constantly mentioned something called the Watcher. My instincts screamed at me to burn the notebook and forget everything, but I couldn't. There was something about those pages that kept pulling me in. I spent hours combing through them, desperately trying to make a connection. And then, I found something unsettling, something that linked the dates and the locations. One of the locations caught my eye, one I recognized. It was nearby, and the date on it matched tonight. I couldn't let it go. I had to know more, even though I knew it was against my better judgment. I decided to go to the place, no matter the risks. The notebook marked it. It was an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. I had no idea what the mark meant, but I was determined to find out. I arrived before midnight. The building was in ruins, windows shattered, walls covered in graffiti. I entered cautiously with a flashlight in hand, navigating through corridors cluttered with debris. That's when I heard it. A soft sound, a distant murmur. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand. "Is anyone here?" I called out. But no one responded. The murmur continued, this time much closer. I followed the sound down a hallway, reaching a room at the end. As I stepped inside, my heart skipped a beat. There, in the center of the room, was a circle drawn on the floor, surrounded by the same symbols from the notebook. Standing inside the circle was a figure, motionless, its head tilted to one side. It wasn't human. It was tall, with limbs that were too long, and its grayish skin seemed to glow under the light of my flashlight. Before I could move, the figure lifted its head. Although it had no visible eyes, I felt its gaze pierce through me. Suddenly, my flashlight flickered and went out. In the pitch black, I heard a whisper, clearer than before. "You shouldn't have come." I quickly flicked the flashlight back on, but the figure was gone. Instead, the circle on the floor was glowing, casting a faint red light. Fear flooded me. I didn't even hesitate. I ran out of the building, not daring to look back. When I got home, I found something that made me scream. The notebook was open on my desk. I had left it closed, and now it was open. There were new annotations, written in the same trembling handwriting. "Now they're watching you. You can't escape." Since that night, strange things began to happen. The lights flickered for no reason. Objects appeared in places I hadn't left them. And at the quietest moments, I could feel a presence, like something, or someone, was with me in the room. I tried to get rid of the notebook, but it always came back. It would show up in my mailbox, or even on my bed, as though it were waiting for me. No matter what I did, it felt like I was trapped in a game I didn't understand. The dreams started too. Every night, I saw the figure standing at the edge of my bed, its long limbs stretched out, its featureless face watching me. I woke up screaming every time, but each time, the dream felt too real, too vivid. It's been months since the package arrived, and now I don't know what's real anymore. I've tried to research the little I can about the Watcher, but all I've learned is that those who encounter it rarely survive to tell their story. Now I live with the constant feeling that I'm being watched. I see it in the shadows, in reflections, in the corners of my house. It's always there. I can feel its presence, always lurking, waiting. I know sooner or later it will come for me. If you ever receive a package you weren't expecting, with strange or disturbing contents, don't do what I did. Don't open it, don't follow its trail, because once you're in its sights, there's no way out. The moment the strange noises began in the attic, I knew something was wrong with the house. What I didn't expect was discovering I wasn't alone, and that what was living with me defied all logic. I had rented the house just a few weeks earlier. It was old, but charming, with high ceilings, creaky wooden floors that groaned with every step, and a fireplace I planned to light once winter came. After years of living in small, noisy apartments, I finally felt like I had a home all to myself. The first few nights were peaceful, save for the usual sounds of an old house. A creak here, a thud there, nothing to worry about. But then, a week later, I started hearing something else. It all began one night while I was reading in the living room. It was a faint noise, like something moving in the attic. I thought it might be an animal, maybe a mouse or even a raccoon. I made a mental note to call an exterminator the next day. However, the noises didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent, scratches, soft thuds, as if something small was crawling or moving back and forth. One night, I even heard what sounded like footsteps. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but one early morning, I was jolted awake by a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen right above my bedroom. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, I decided to go up into the attic and see what was going on. Armed with a flashlight, I gathered my courage. The attic stairs were hidden behind a trapdoor in the hallway. I opened it, revealing an old wooden ladder that creaked with every step I took. The attic was dark and dusty, filled with old boxes and furniture draped in sheets. The beam of my flashlight moved from one corner to another, but I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't until I reached the far end of the attic that I stopped dead in my tracks. There were marks on the floor, long, deep scratches, as if something had dragged across the wood. My heart started to race as I followed the trail with my flashlight. The marks led to a dark corner, where the light couldn't reach. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The silence answered back. But just as I was about to turn away, I heard a faint whisper. I don't know what it said, but it froze me to my core. I dropped the flashlight in my panic to get out of there, and slammed the trapdoor shut behind me with such force that the echo reverberated through the entire house. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in bed, listening to every creak, every thud, convinced something was watching me from above. The next day, I decided to call a friend, Matt. I told him everything that had happened. While he joked about my paranoia, he agreed to come over and check the attic with me. Matt arrived, armed with a bigger flashlight and a baseball bat, joking that he was going to hunt down the hell raccoon. I didn't share his enthusiasm, but I did feel a little safer with him there. We went up together. This time, the attic felt darker than before, as if the light from our flashlight was being swallowed by the darkness. Matt checked every corner, moved boxes, even knocked on the walls with the bat to make sure there were no hidden spaces. "Nothing here," he said finally, grinning triumphantly. Just as he finished speaking, we both heard a loud, sharp thud. It came from the far side of the attic, from an old wooden chest we hadn't checked. Matt cautiously approached the chest, baseball bat raised. I stayed behind, my heart in my throat. When he opened the chest, the first thing we saw was an old photograph. They looked like family pictures, but something was wrong. The faces of the people in the photos were blurry, as if they had been scratched or burned. Among the photos were other objects, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, a rusty pocket watch, and at the very back of the trunk, there was an old doll with glass eyes that seemed to stare directly at us. Matt carefully picked it up. "This is strange," he said, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in his voice. Then we heard it, a whisper, louder this time. The doll fell to the ground, rolling toward me. Before I could react, something shot out from the dark corner. It was fast, more shadow than form, moving unnaturally, as if its limbs weren't working properly. "Matt!" I screamed as he raised the bat. But before he could swing, the shadow lunged at him. I cried out and bolted down the stairs, not daring to look back. Matt followed seconds later, panting and pale. "We have to get out of here!" he shouted, slamming the hatch shut behind him. We ran out of the house, not once glancing back. I didn't return that night, nor the nights after. Desperate, I called a paranormal expert. Though I was skeptical, I was at my wits' end. The man who arrived seemed to know what he was doing. He went up to the attic with strange equipment and began his work, while Matt and I waited outside. Hours later, he came down from the attic, looking far more serious than when he'd gone up. "There's something in this house," he said, his voice grave. "Something old, something angry. I'm not sure how it started, but these things, they don't stay still. I recommend you leave. Don't wait any longer." I moved out within days, leaving most of my belongings behind. Years have passed, and the house still stands empty. I occasionally pass by, and I always glance up at the attic windows. They're dark and vacant, but I always feel like something is watching me from within. I don't know what it was that lived in that house, but I learned a lesson I'll never forget. If you ever hear noises in a place that should be empty, don't ignore them. Because sometimes, what lives in the dark doesn't want to be discovered, and if you find it, it might not let you go. It was the moment I turned on the TV and saw the broadcast that I knew something was terribly wrong. I hadn't been expecting anything unusual. I just wanted to unwind after a long day, but what I saw on the screen pulled me into a mystery that blurred the line between reality and madness. It was an ordinary Monday night. I came home, made myself a quick dinner, and collapsed on the couch, ready to relax. When I turned on the TV, the channel that usually aired local news was showing something completely different. Instead of a news program, what appeared was a blurry image of a dark room. A flickering light hung from the ceiling, and a wooden chair sat in the center of the room. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of technical error, maybe a disrupted signal. But then something moved in the corner of the screen. A figure appeared, blurred and almost impossible to make out in the darkness. It looked like a man, though I couldn't see his face clearly. He was hunched over, moving slowly toward the chair in the middle of the room. The camera didn't move. Everything seemed far too real, like someone had placed a static camera to record the scene. The man sat down in the chair, staring directly at the camera. Even though the image was blurry, something about his posture deeply unsettled me. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me through the screen. I tried to change the channel, but the remote didn't respond. Suddenly, the volume shot up, and a low buzzing sound began coming from the speakers. It was like a swarm of bees mixed with something metallic. I shivered and tried to turn off the TV, but the power button wouldn't work either. I looked back at the screen. The figure was still there, but now it seemed much closer. I hadn't seen it move, but its face, still indistinguishable, was now right up to the camera. I started to feel dizzy. The buzzing grew deafening. Something was terribly wrong, and I couldn't escape it. The room seemed to close in around me. That was when the man spoke. Although his voice didn't come through the speakers, I heard it in my head. "Why are you watching?" I jumped off the sofa, my heart racing. I backed up against the wall, my eyes still fixed on the screen. The man continued to speak, though his mouth didn't move. "This isn't for you. You shouldn't be here." Then, the image on the screen changed. It was no longer the room with the chair. Now it was my living room, my sofa, my table, even the plate I had left on the coffee table. But something was wrong with the image. I wasn't alone. Behind the sofa, I could see a dark figure, barely visible in the shadows. I spun around abruptly, but no one was there. I looked back at the screen, and now the figure was closer, right behind the sofa. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but there was no dial tone. The screen on my phone was completely blank. Suddenly, the TV turned off, leaving the room in eerie silence. A few seconds passed before I heard a noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in the house. I glanced toward the hallway, where the light flickered weakly with every step I took closer. The tapping grew louder. Eventually, I realized it was coming from my bedroom. I slowly opened the door, holding my breath. In the center of the room stood a chair, an identical one to the one I had seen on the TV. It was empty, but the tapping continued. It was coming from my mirror. The surface of the mirror vibrated like water, and at its center, I saw the man's figure staring at me from the other side. Though his face showed no expression, I could feel his intention. He was inviting me to cross. "Come!" His voice echoed inside my head again. My head jerked back toward the door, and the man tilted his head as if studying me. I ran out of the room and locked myself in the bathroom, turning on the light, trying to convince myself that I was just imagining things. Minutes later, when I finally gathered the courage to leave, the mirror in my room was intact, and the chair had vanished. Since that night, things haven't been the same. Sometimes, when I turn on the TV, the image flickers briefly, and I see the room with the chair again. I've stopped looking at the screen for too long, terrified that something might be watching me back. And every time I pass a mirror, I feel like something is waiting there. If your TV ever shows something that shouldn't be there, turn it off immediately. And if you can't turn it off, leave the house, because sometimes, what's watching you from the other side doesn't want you to look. But if you do, you might not be able to escape. The moment I saw the figure standing at the edge of my bed, I knew something was terribly wrong. I wasn't dreaming. What had started as a quiet night in my new apartment was about to become an experience that would change my life forever. I had only moved in a few weeks ago. It was small but cozy, perfect for one person. There was something charming about the old building, with its narrow hallways and creaking floors. But there was an unsettling air that seemed to hang in the rooms, like something was lurking just out of sight, watching me. The elevators creaking always unsettled me. Although the nightly noises often sent chills down my spine, I kept telling myself they were just normal sounds in an old building. That night, I had gone to bed early, exhausted after a long day at work. I fell asleep quickly, but something woke me in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't understand what had pulled me from my dream. It was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of street lamps filtering through the curtains. That's when I saw it. A tall, thin figure, completely black like a solid shadow, was standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't see any details. No eyes, no face, no clothing, just a dark, motionless shape that seemed to absorb the little light in the room. My body froze. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from my throat. It was as if something had stolen my voice. We stayed like that, the two of us, for what seemed like hours, though it was likely only a few seconds. I was trapped in my own bed, unable to move, while this thing stared at me in silence. Finally, it moved its head slightly, tilting its face to the side, almost as if it was studying me more closely. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but enough to break the spell. My body reacted before my mind could process it. I lunged for the lamp on the nightstand. When the light flickered on, it filled the room, but the figure was gone. I spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, the lights on, my heart pounding 1,000 miles per hour. I tried to convince myself it was just a vivid dream, some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was letting my imagination get out of control. However, things quickly began to get worse. Over the next few nights, the noises started again. First, it was a soft tapping on the walls, like someone was gently knocking from the other side. Then came footsteps, pacing across the ceiling, odd, considering I lived on the top floor of the building. One night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard something even more disturbing. A whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably coming from my room. "You're not alone." I jumped out of bed, turned on all the lights, and stayed awake until dawn. The next day, I called my landlord to ask if anyone else had reported similar issues in the building. His response sent a chill down my spine. "Oh, you live in 4B?" he asked, his voice strange. "Yes, why?" "Well, let's just say that apartment has a history," he said, his tone dropping. He explained that the previous tenant, a reclusive man, had vanished without a trace. His belongings were still in the apartment when it was found empty, as though he had disappeared overnight. I tried to ignore what he had said, but it was impossible to shake the feeling. That night, fear paralyzed me as I lay in bed, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. Not for long, though. I woke up with an overwhelming sense that someone was in the room. I opened my eyes, and there it was. The figure had returned, this time standing even closer, next to my bed. I wanted to move, to scream, to do anything, but I couldn't. It was as if some invisible force was holding me down, freezing me in place. my body simply wouldn't respond. The figure leaned in toward me, its face, if it had one, just inches from mine. Although there were no visible eyes, I could feel its gaze, as though it was looking deep into my mind. "Help me!" it whispered in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves. Finally, my body reacted and I jumped up, gasping for air, and the figure had disappeared again. The next morning, I contacted my friend David, who believed in the paranormal. I told him everything that had been happening, and he insisted on coming over that same night. He brought with him a recorder and a device to detect energy shifts. I didn't really believe in these things, but I was desperate. David began asking questions while recording. "Is someone here with us? Who are you? Why are you here?" At first, nothing happened, but then, suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, and the recorder picked up something that our ears couldn't hear at the time. When we played the recording back, a clear response followed the last question. "This is my home." That was the last night I spent in that apartment. I packed up and left the next day, leaving everything behind. I didn't want to know anything more about it. Later, I found out that other tenants in apartment 4B had also reported strange occurrences. Nobody stayed long. The apartment is now empty, although sometimes when I walk past the building, I think I see something dark moving behind the windows. I don't know what that figure was or what it wanted, but I learned one thing: if you ever feel like something is watching you in the dark, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, what we think are just shadows could be much more alive than we imagine. The moment my clock stopped at 3:33 in the morning, I knew something was wrong. In the silence of the night, the world seemed frozen, and what followed made me question reality itself. It was a night like any other. I had stayed up late working on a project, surrounded by papers and with a cold cup of coffee within reach. Finally, I decided to go to bed, leaving the mess for the next morning. I fell asleep almost immediately, but hours later, I woke up with an unsettling feeling. I looked at the digital clock on my nightstand. It was exactly 3:33 in the morning, and the second hand had stopped moving. The light from the numbers stayed fixed, as if time had come to a halt. I thought it was a malfunction, so I got up and tried to reset the clock, but it didn't respond. Then, I noticed something even more disturbing. The rest of the house was in complete silence. There was always some sound at night: the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the pipes, the distant sound of traffic. But this time, there was nothing. It was a heavy, absolute silence that seemed to fill the room. I got out of bed, my body overwhelmed by an inexplicable sense of alertness. I walked into the living room, where the wall clock was also stopped, its second hand frozen between two ticks. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping, like someone was knocking on the window. My skin prickled. The living room window overlooked the backyard garden and was surrounded by a tall fence. No one could get there easily. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a shadow moving on the other side of the glass. It wasn't a human figure, at least not entirely. The shadow was tall and thin, with a shape that twisted as if it couldn't stay still. The thing tapped the window again, 3 times, in a deliberate rhythm. I breathed deeply and gently moved the curtain aside, just enough to take a peek. There was nothing there. I stepped back, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe I was dreaming, or it was an illusion caused by exhaustion. But then the tapping started again, this time, from the kitchen window. I walked slowly toward it, armed only with my phone, its screen now completely black. The kitchen light flickered. It happened in the dead of night. The power went out the moment I stepped closer to the window. I could barely make out the shadow that was now even closer, its amorphous shape pressed against the glass. Suddenly it leaned forward, and 2 glowing eyes, bright like small embers, opened in the darkness. "Let me in," said a low, guttural voice that seemed to echo inside my head. I ran back to my room and locked the door behind me, my mind racing with panic. I had no idea what to do. The sounds of soft footsteps filled the house, like something was slowly moving through it, creeping closer. Then the voice spoke again, but this time, it was from the other side of the door. "Time is broken. Let me fix it." I glanced at the clock beside my bed. It was still frozen at 3:33, the same time as before, as if time itself had been caught in an endless loop. "Go away," I whispered, though I wasn't even sure if whatever it was could hear me. The voice responded with a soft laugh, the kind that sent a chill straight to my bones. Minutes, maybe hours, passed. The footsteps eventually stopped, and silence returned. But the clock stayed frozen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. When I finally gathered enough courage to leave the room, the house was empty. The lights flickered weakly, and the air felt thick with an eerie, metallic scent, like something had burned. But the worst part was the wall clock in the living room. Though its hands were still stuck at 3:33, someone, or something, had written on the glass with trembling fingers. "I'll be back at 3:33. Weeks have passed since that night, and now every morning, without fail, I wake up at exactly 3:33. The clock works again, but it always shows that time right before I open my eyes, as if someone, or something, wants to remind me that it's still out there. I don't know what it wants or why it chose me, but I know it hasn't left. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I hear 3 knocks on my window, always 3, always in the same rhythm. If your clock ever stops at 3:33 a.m., don't ignore it. Don't get up, and above all, don't look out the window. Because whatever is out there is waiting for the moment when you do. It all started when I noticed the swing moving. That's when I knew something was off at the park. It was a quiet night, and I had gone there seeking peace, but what I found was far darker than I could have imagined. I've always loved taking walks at night. There's something about the stillness of the world asleep that helps me think. The park near my house was one of my favorite spots, with its tree-lined paths and a small playground at the end. I often sat on a bench by the swings, just enjoying the fresh air. That night felt like any other. The stars were out, and the gentle breeze whispered through the trees. But as soon as I reached the playground, an unsettling feeling crept over me. The park was completely deserted, just like it always was at that hour, but there was something in the air, a sense that I wasn't alone. I sat on my usual bench, pulled out my phone to read something, and tried to ignore the growing sense of unease. That's when I saw it. The swing started to move slowly. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the breeze barely stirred the leaves. The swing didn't move erratically, like it would if the wind were pushing it. It swayed back and forth with a deliberate rhythm, as if an invisible presence was sitting on it. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe the swing was unbalanced, or the chains were worn. I stepped closer to inspect it, but as soon as I took a few steps toward it, the swing stopped abruptly. The air around the park grew colder, and I looked around for any sign of another person, but there was no one. Not anyone I could see, at least. Then I heard it. A soft, childish laugh, like the giggle of a young child, echoed in the silence, and I knew deep down that something far darker than I had imagined was waiting there, watching. It felt distant, as if it came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. My body trembled with laughter that had no place in the silence of the night. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The laughter stopped abruptly, and the swing began to move again, this time faster. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but something kept me there, as if I needed to understand what was happening. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a child standing across the playground, but when my eyes focused, I realized it was no child at all. The figure was small and thin, but its silhouette seemed wrong. Its arms were too long for its body, and its head tilted at an odd angle. I couldn't see its face, it was too dark. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer, but it started moving toward me. It wasn't walking, it was sliding, as if its feet never touched the ground. Panic took over me. I turned and ran, my breath drowning out every other sound. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. When I reached the park entrance, I stopped to catch my breath, making sure it hadn't followed me. The park was completely silent now, the swings motionless under the dim moonlight. I thought I was safe, until I got home. I opened my apartment door, turned on the lights, and locked it behind me, still shaking. I told myself it had all been my imagination, a misunderstanding fueled by the darkness and my exhaustion. But then I heard a soft knock. It came from my window. My apartment was on the 3rd floor. There was no way anyone could be outside my window, but the knock came again, this time louder. I moved slowly, my heart pounding. As I pulled back the curtain, there was no one there, but on the glass, written with thin, trembling fingers, were the words, "Do you want to play?" I didn't sleep that night. Since then, I've stopped going to that park, but the feeling of being watched has never left me. Sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I hear the sound of a swing moving, as if someone is playing alone in the dark. If you ever find yourself in a park at night and feel like you're not alone, trust your instincts, because there are things that lurk in the most innocent places, and sometimes, they just want to play with you. It was the moment when the bathroom mirror fogged up with words that I knew something wasn't right in my apartment. There was no one else home, yet the message, written with crooked letters, told me otherwise. It was an ordinary night. I had come home after a long day of work and decided to take a hot shower to relax. The steam quickly filled the small bathroom, covering the mirror with an opaque layer. When I stepped out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, I saw it. On the fogged-up mirror, there were words as if a finger had traced them. "You're not alone." I froze, water still dripping from my hair. I knew it couldn't be a joke. I lived alone, and I hadn't let anyone in. I tried to wipe away the message with my hand, but even after cleaning the mirror, the words remained, as if they were etched into the glass. My heart raced as I checked every corner of the apartment. I looked under the bed, behind the curtains, even inside the closets. Nothing. Finally, convinced that I was just imagining things, I returned to the bathroom. But this time, the words had changed. "I see you." The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I spun around, expecting to find someone behind me, but the bathroom was empty. The apartment was completely silent, except for my fast, shallow breathing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that maybe there was something wrong with the mirror. Perhaps it was some old prank someone had played before I moved in. It was the only logical explanation. I decided to leave the bathroom, shut the door, and I tried to forget what I had seen, but things only got worse. That night, I woke up at 3 a.m., with an eerie sensation that something was in my room. Everything was pitch black, except for the faint light that filtered in through the street lamp outside. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something that took my breath away. In the corner of my room, where my full-length mirror stood, a dark figure was reflected in the glass. It was tall, with elongated limbs and a hunched posture, like it couldn't fully stand upright. I froze, too terrified to move. But the worst part was realizing that the figure wasn't actually in the room with me. It was only in the reflection. I gathered enough courage to slowly sit up and turn on the light. The reflection vanished, and the mirror only showed my empty room. I turned off the light and crawled back into bed, trying to convince myself that it had been some kind of dream illusion. But no sooner had I closed my eyes than I heard a whisper. "Let me in." I jumped out of bed, flicking on every light. I glanced at the mirror, and though there was no figure, this time there was a message written on the surface, as if it had been etched from the inside of the glass. "I'm always here." I couldn't sleep that night. Over the following days, more strange things began to happen. The mirrors in my apartment seemed to reflect things that weren't there, shadows moving, faces that weren't mine, and always, always that unsettling feeling that something was watching me from the other side. I tried to get rid of them. I removed every mirror and threw them all in the trash, but by the next day, they were back, right where they had been before. I started searching for answers online, reading about paranormal phenomena associated with mirrors. Some people claimed they were portals, windows to another world or dimension, and sometimes, something could cross over. I tried to seal them with black fabric, following advice from the forums. For a few days it worked. But then one night, I found one of the mirrors uncovered, with a new message written on it. "You can't hide from me." I finally contacted a paranormal expert. When he arrived, he inspected the apartment with an increasingly concerned expression. "There's something trapped here," he said, his voice grave. "Something is using the mirrors to manifest." I asked him if he could get rid of it, but he shook his head. "It's not just the mirrors. This is already tied to you." Since that conversation, my life has never been the same. I moved to a new apartment, but the mirrors still behave strangely. Sometimes, when I pass by one, I see shadows that shouldn't be there, or a reflection that takes a second longer than normal to move. I can't look at myself in a mirror anymore without feeling like something, or someone, is staring back at me. If you ever notice something strange in a mirror, an odd reflection, or words that appear with no explanation, don't ignore it. You might be opening a door you didn't know existed. Because sometimes, mirrors don't just reflect what's in front of them. Sometimes they reflect what lurks beyond. And when I heard the first knock coming from the basement, I knew something was terribly wrong. There shouldn't have been anyone down there. It was late and I lived alone, and what happened that night made me wish I'd never investigated my house. It was an old house, the kind with high ceilings, creaky floors, and of course, a dark basement that I rarely ventured into. I only used it to store things I didn't need. Despite having lived there for 2 years, there was always something unsettling about that place. It was past midnight, and I was sitting in the living room, watching a movie, when I heard a loud, dry thud coming from below. I froze, my mind racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe something had fallen from one of the shelves, or perhaps a gust of wind had moved something. But I couldn't shake the fact that the basement had no windows or ventilation. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, waiting to hear something else. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Just when I was about to convince myself I'd imagined the sound, another, louder thud echoed, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Fear paralyzed me. My eyes instinctively went to the door that led to the basement, a heavy wooden door with an old doorknob. It was closed, as it always was. Slowly, I crept closer, hearing every creak of the floor beneath my feet. "Hello?" My voice barely a whisper. No answer. But the footsteps continued. I swallowed hard and leaned toward the door, pressing my ear against it. The steps were erratic, like someone was pacing back and forth downstairs. I took a deep breath, my mind torn between logic and the overwhelming instinct to flee. "It's just your imagination," I kept repeating to myself, but I knew that wasn't true. I carefully opened the door, feeling the cold, damp air from the basement rise up to meet me. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, phone in hand, casting a beam of light down the steps. The basement was just as I remembered, cluttered with stacked boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. But something felt off. "Is anyone down here?" I asked, my voice shaking. For a moment, nothing. Then, from the farthest corner of the basement, where my phone's light couldn't reach, I heard a creak followed by a low, heavy breath. My heart raced as I pointed the light toward the corner. And then, my heart stopped. Something was there. At first, I thought it was just a shadow caused by the clutter, but then it moved. It was a figure crouched down, too large to be an animal, but with a posture that didn't seem human. My phone's light flickered, and the figure slowly rose to its feet. The last thing I saw before the battery of my phone died were two bright eyes staring at me from the darkness. I screamed and ran up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind went blank, my heart pounding in my ears. I barricaded myself in my room, shoving a chair against the door, and grabbing a kitchen knife in my shaking hands. I tried to call someone, but my phone wouldn't turn on. For hours I heard creaks, footsteps, and something else, closer now, like it was circling my room. I didn't dare move. Strange noises throughout the house, like something was hunting me. The house was filled with loud, eerie knocks, coming from all corners, as though something was searching for me. When I finally mustered the courage to leave my room, everything was perfectly in place, too perfect. The basement door was still shut, as if nothing had ever happened. I tried convincing myself it was just a bad dream, but when I went down to the basement the next day, I found the marks. Deep scratches on the concrete floor, as if something with claws had been dragging itself across the ground. Weeks have passed since that night, and I still can't sleep without hearing those footsteps echoing in my mind, that creaking sound that still resonates in my chest. I sold the house and moved away, but something followed me. Sometimes, on the quietest nights, I hear a dull thud from the closet or a faint creak beneath the floor. Whatever it is, it didn't stay in the basement. If you ever hear something in a place where there shouldn't be anything, don't investigate. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The terrifying message that shook me to the core. It all started the moment I received the text message. I knew something was wrong the instant I saw it. I didn't recognize the number, but the message content was enough to freeze my blood. "Why haven't you replied? I'm right outside." It was almost 11 at night, and I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a blanket, watching TV. I had had a long day and wasn't expecting visitors, let alone such a disturbing message. At first, I thought it was just a mistake or a prank, but when I glanced out the window into the empty street, my heart began to race. My house is in a quiet neighborhood, with homes spaced far apart by wide gardens. At night, the lamplights cast long shadows that sway in the wind. There was no one on my street. At least, not that I could see. I decided to ignore the message and continue watching my show, but barely a minute later, my phone buzzed again. "I'm watching you. Why do you keep ignoring me?" This time, the message included a photo. It was a picture of my house, taken from somewhere near the front garden. My blood ran cold. I quickly jumped up, turning on all the lights and making sure the doors were locked. I looked through every window, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I called the number from which the messages had been sent, but it rang several times before going to voicemail. The automated voice didn't say a name, just the generic number of the line. As I tried to convince myself it was all just a cruel joke, another message arrived. "That won't help. I'm closer than you think." My body tensed as my eyes scanned the living room. I was trying not to panic, but the fear was starting to overwhelm me. I dialed 911, explaining the situation as quickly as I could. The operator tried to reassure me, promising that an officer would be sent right away. When I hung up, the house was eerily quiet. Every creak of the walls, every shift in the wind felt amplified. I decided to wait in the hallway, as far away from the windows as possible, clutching a knife in my hand. Then I heard the tapping. It was coming from the back door. Soft, slow knocks. I didn't dare move. I froze, listening to the persistent sound, each thud growing louder in my ears. Finally, I gathered the courage to approach the door. Through the frosted glass, I saw a shadow, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. I was completely still, save for the gentle knock of a hand tapping softly on the door. My phone vibrated once more in my hand. "Open the door. I'll come in anyway," it said. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my ears. I shouted that the police were on their way, hoping it would be enough to scare off whoever was on the other side. But the shadow didn't move. Instead of leaving, the knocking stopped, and everything went quiet. I thought maybe they had gone, but when I moved closer to the window to look out at the backyard, I saw something that made me recoil with a stifled scream. There, written on the glass, was a word formed by what looked like a wet finger. The lights flickered and went out suddenly, plunging the house into complete darkness. My phone was the only source of light, but its battery was almost dead. I ran toward the front door, thinking I'd step outside and wait for the police there. But when I twisted the knob, the door wouldn't open. It was as if it were locked from the outside. My phone vibrated one last time, too late. I felt a movement behind me, a cold draft, as though someone was standing very close. My mind screamed at me not to turn around, but my body didn't obey. The last thing I saw before everything went black were two glowing eyes reflecting in the darkness. When I woke up, I was lying in the front yard. The flashing lights of a patrol car lit up the street, and an officer was speaking to me, asking me to tell him what had happened inside the house. They found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, no traces of anyone else. The only thing left was my phone, the messages erased and the battery completely drained. Since that night, I've had recurring nightmares, always with those glowing eyes staring at me from the shadows. I left that house soon after, but the feeling of being watched has never left me. If you ever receive a strange message, especially one that seems to know more about you than it should, don't ignore it. You never know who's really on the other side, or how close they might be. The moment I saw the name, Jake Morrison, on the badge pinned to his shirt, my blood ran cold. Jake. The quiet guy from chemistry class. Now he was standing right in front of me, with a look in his eyes that burned with intensity. This wasn't the reunion I had been expecting. It was the beginning of a nightmare. 10 years. That's how long it had been since I walked the halls of Westfield High School. A decade spent building a career, making new friends, and trying to forget the awkwardness of my teenage years. When the invitation to the reunion arrived, I hesitated to go. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see how much everyone had changed, to measure my own progress against theirs. It was pure vanity. If I'd known what was waiting for me, I would have burned that invitation and never looked back. The reunion was held in the school gym, transformed for the occasion with streamers, balloons, and a sad disco ball. The smell of punch and nostalgia filled the air. I arrived late, thinking I'd make a grand entrance. Instead, I slipped in almost unnoticed, as the conversations of hundreds of people filled the space. I recognized a few familiar faces here and there. The football team captain, now sporting a prominent beer belly, the head cheerleader, with a smile that was just a little too wide and desperate. Everyone was trying too hard to impress, showing off how well they had done since high school. It was exhausting. I was about to head to the bar for a much-needed drink when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around. And there he was, Jake Morrison. Jake had always been the kind of guy you could easily overlook in high school. Quiet, average-looking, always sitting at the back of the classroom. We'd worked together on a couple of chemistry projects, but I couldn't recall ever having a real conversation with him. Now, though, he was standing right in front of me, grinning widely, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I knew you'd be here," he said, his voice carrying a strange enthusiasm, almost forced. "Jake," I said, struggling to find something to say. "It's been a while. How've you been?" His smile widened even more. "Oh, I've been great. Really great. I've thought about you a lot." There was something about the way he said it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I brushed it off. After all, it was Jake, the quiet, seemingly harmless guy. "Good to hear," I replied, already looking for an excuse to walk away. "I was about to grab a drink. It was nice seeing you." I turned to leave, but his hand shot out, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. Let me get you something to drink, he insisted. What do you like? Before I could protest, he was already steering me toward the bar. I could feel the eyes of old classmates on us, their faces a mix of curiosity and confusion. Jake Morrison and Sarah Thompson, a pair nobody could have predicted. As we waited for our drinks, Jake didn't stop talking. He seemed to know everything about my life since high school, my job, where I lived, even the name of my cat. It was unsettling. How do you know all this? I asked, unable to hide the sharp edge in my voice. He just smiled, that same smile that made me feel like he was only doing it to make me uncomfortable. I like to stay up to date on old friends, he said, his tone almost too casual. Especially people like you. A chill ran down my spine as I took a long drink, hoping the alcohol would steady my nerves. Jake didn't take his eyes off me, studying every movement I made like he was analyzing an experiment. As the night wore on, I tried to distance myself from Jake, excusing myself to the bathroom. But when I stepped outside for some fresh air, there he was, right beside me, as if he'd been waiting. Remember that chemistry project we did together? He asked, his voice soft as the cool night air brushed against my skin. Yeah, I said, though I didn't trust my own voice. Of course I remembered. It was the only time we'd ever worked together. I learned a lot from that project, he continued, almost dreamily. About chemicals, sure. But also about you. How you used to bite your lip when you were focused. The smell of your shampoo. The sound of your laugh. Alarm bells started ringing in my head. This wasn't some nostalgic memory. This was something else entirely. Jake, I said carefully, my heart beginning to race. That was a long time ago. We were just teenagers. His expression shifted. His face darkened, and his voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone. It doesn't feel like it was that long ago, he said. It feels like yesterday. Every day feels like yesterday when I think about you, Sarah. I took a step back, but he closed the distance between us. I've waited so long for this night, he whispered. To see you again. To tell you how I feel. I think I should go, I said, my voice trembling. I turned to head back to the gym, but his hand snapped out, gripping my wrist like a vice. You can't leave, he said, his face now a mask of desperation and fury. Not yet. Not when we have so much to talk about. With a desperate jerk, I managed to break free from his grip and ran back into the gym. My heart was pounding in my chest as my eyes scanned the room, looking for someone, anyone, who might be able to help me. But everyone was caught up in their own conversations, laughing and reminiscing about the good old days. Nobody noticed my panic. Then I felt his presence before I even saw him. I turned, and there he was, Jake, his face twisted into an expression of barely contained rage. Why are you running from me? He demanded, his voice dripping with bitterness. After everything I've done for you, you just ignore me. Like that. Confused, I asked. What have you done? And terrified, Jake, we barely knew each other back in high school. We hadn't spoken in 10 years. A rough laugh escaped him, one so jarring it made several people nearby glance over, intrigued. Oh, Sarah, he said, shaking his head. We've talked every day. You just didn't know it was me. A chill ran through my body as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. The anonymous messages I'd been receiving for years. That strange feeling of being watched when I was alone. The mysterious gifts that would show up at my door with no sender. It was you, I whispered, my stomach sinking, my voice barely audible. All this time, it was you. Jake nodded, a sinister grin spreading across his face. I knew you'd figure it out eventually. I was always there for you, Sarah. Watching over you. And now, finally, we can be together. I recoiled, bumping into a drink table. You're insane, I said, my voice cracking, desperate to stay calm. You need help. His expression hardened, the smile quickly replaced by rage. Insane? I'm not insane, he shot back, his voice low and cold. I love you, Sarah. I've loved you for 10 years. While you ignored me, while you dated other men, while you lived your life without me, but that ends tonight. Jake took a step toward me, and all I could think to do was run. I shoved past people, ignoring the confused stares and murmurs of protest. The only thing that mattered was escaping. I bolted for the parking lot, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears it almost drowned out everything else. Desperately, I fumbled through my purse, my hands trembling uncontrollably, nearly dropping my keys. Behind me, I heard his voice, harsh and unrelenting. Sarah, he shouted. You can't run from this. We're meant to be together. Finally, I grabbed my keys, dashed into my car, and slammed the door shut just as Jake reached me. He hit the driver's side window with a violent thud, his face twisted in frustration and desperation. Don't do this! He screamed, his voice echoing in the quiet of the parking lot. You know I love you! I started the engine, and before he could say another word, I slammed my foot on the gas, sending a cloud of gravel flying in my rearview mirror. As I sped away, I saw Jake standing under the harsh lights of the parking lot, motionless, his figure frozen in the distance as I drove further and further away. I drove for hours, unable to bring myself to go home. Finally, I stopped at a gas station and, with trembling hands, called the police. My voice shook as I recounted everything that had happened. When they arrived, they took my statement and promised to investigate, but I could hear the skepticism in their voices. To them, it probably sounded like some bizarre, creepy reunion gone wrong. But I knew the truth. In the following days, the police uncovered evidence of Jake's obsession. Hidden cameras in my apartment. A notebook filled with detailed notes on my daily routine. Jake was arrested, but somehow, he managed to get out on bail while waiting for trial. Now I live in constant fear. I changed my phone number, deleted all my social media accounts, and I'm even considering moving to a different city. But the paranoia remains. Every time I get a call from an unknown number, every time I see someone who looks like him on the street, the panic comes rushing back. Jake is still out there. And even though the authorities assure me they're keeping an eye on him, I know that doesn't guarantee my safety. I'm working hard to reclaim my life. I've started seeing a therapist, trying to learn how to cope with the trauma. But the memory of that night, of his obsessive stare, still haunts me. The girl who walked into that gym, curious and unaware, is gone. In her place is someone more cautious, more vigilant. And though I won't let Jake win, the moment I saw his eyes in the rearview mirror, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. What should have been a routine delivery turned into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a regular night, but I found myself trapped in my car with a man who clearly had no intention of letting me leave. This was my last delivery of the night. I had been working for DoorDash for months, trying to earn some extra cash to help pay off my student loans. Most nights were uneventful. Pick up food, drop it off, repeat. But that night? Everything was different from the very start. The order came in just as I was about to log off for the night. It was from a restaurant I'd never heard of before, a small, rundown place on the outskirts of town. The delivery address was even further out, a lonely house at the end of a winding road. For a moment, I hesitated. Something didn't feel right. My gut told me something was off, but the tip promised was generous, and I thought, one more delivery won't hurt. I should have listened to my instincts. The restaurant itself was unsettling, to say the least. It looked like an old, dilapidated building with flickering neon signs and windows so filthy you could barely see inside. The man who handed me the food barely even looked at me. He just shoved a greasy bag into my hands and muttered something, maybe, "Have a good night," as I turned to leave. As I drove toward the delivery address, the houses started getting fewer and farther between. The road narrowed, winding through a dense forest. My GPS lost signal, leaving me to rely on the vague directions I had memorized. After what felt like forever, I finally saw the right number on a solitary mailbox. The driveway was long and unpaved, leading up to a rundown house far from the main road. There were no lights on, and for a moment, I thought about leaving the food in the mailbox. But that tip was still on my mind. So, I gathered my courage and drove all the way to the end of the driveway. The house looked as desolate as the restaurant, peeling paint, shutters hanging askew, and not a single car in sight. I sat in my car for a moment, debating whether I should get out. Then I saw movement in one of the dark windows. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the food and stepped out of the car. The sound of gravel crunching beneath my feet seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Each step felt heavier than the last. I rang the doorbell, the sound echoing inside the house. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. The man who answered was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, my dinner has arrived," he said, his voice formal, eerily calm. "Please come in. I'll get the money." Every alarm in my head went off. Everything in me screamed to turn and run, but for some reason I couldn't explain, I stepped inside the house. The interior was just as neglected as the outside, peeling wallpaper, a damp, musty smell, and the air thick enough to make you want to turn back. The man disappeared into another room, leaving me standing awkwardly in the hallway. Then I saw it, the photos on the wall. Dozens of them, scattered across the walls in no particular order. Women of all ages, photographed in everyday situations. Some behind counters, others getting out of cars, some even looking directly into the camera with expressions of surprise or discomfort. There was something disturbingly intimate about each photo, as if none of these women knew they were being photographed. I moved closer, scanning the pictures frantically, and then I saw it. One of the photos was of a delivery driver, wearing a DoorDash jacket. My stomach dropped. Without thinking, I backed away toward the door, ready to bolt out of the house and never look back. But when I turned around, the man was standing there, blocking the exit. "Leave?" he said, his smile completely gone. "But we haven't had dinner yet." I tried to push past him, but his arm shot out with surprising strength, grabbing me with an iron grip. "I can't let you go," he said, his voice low, almost regretful. "I've been waiting for someone like you for a long time." What happened next is a blur. I remember struggling, screaming, the sound of something breaking. Somehow, I managed to break free and I ran towards my car, and the seconds that followed felt like the longest of my life. The sound of my keys hitting the ground echoed in the air as I trembled, desperately trying to pick them up. The sound of footsteps behind me sent a chill down my spine, and the sensation of a hand grabbing my shoulder sent a wave of panic through my body. Just as I managed to get into the car and slam the door shut, I started the engine with my shaking hands, barely keeping calm enough to put the car in gear. He slammed his fist against my window, his face twisted with fury. But before he could do anything else, I slammed on the accelerator and sped down the driveway. I thought I was safe, but I was wrong. As I drove down the driveway, my heart still pounding, I saw lights flashing in my rearview mirror, headlights that were closing in fast. He was following me. The car behind me was an old model, its engine roaring as it gained ground. The winding road left no room for error, and the darkness made each turn even more dangerous. My hands gripped the wheel tighter as I fought to keep control while he closed the distance. Suddenly, I felt the impact. His car slammed into my rear bumper, shaking my entire vehicle and sending my head crashing into the headrest. My car skidded, but I managed to straighten it out just in time. The fear quickly transformed into pure adrenaline. I pressed the accelerator, praying that my old car had enough power to keep the distance. The road twisted between dense trees, and for miles there were no lights or signs of life. My GPS was dead, leaving me alone with nothing but my instincts and the hope that I would find a way out soon. Another impact hit my car, this time harder. I felt the rear wheels slide toward the ditch before I regained control. I could see him now in my rearview mirror, his dark face illuminated by the headlights of his car, his silhouette just a few feet behind. "Come on," I whispered between clenched teeth, pushing the accelerator even harder. Finally, like a miracle, I saw a flash of light in the distance, a lit sign. A gas station. It was my only chance. I turned sharply into the parking lot, my tires screeching as the car came to a stop in front of the store. I jumped out and ran inside, barely managing to open the glass door before it closed behind me. The attendant, an older man with thick glasses, looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. "Please call the police!" I shouted, my voice breaking from the panic. "There's a man behind me. He's trying to kill me!" The attendant didn't ask any questions. He grabbed the phone and began dialing, while I hid behind the counter, peeking through the window. I saw his car appear at the edge of the parking lot, but to my relief, it didn't come in. Instead, he slowed down and drove past, his headlights disappearing into the dark. When the police arrived, I told them everything, about the house, the pictures, the chase. They listened seriously, inspected my car, and took my statement. The next day, the officers located the house, but it was empty. There were no pictures, no trace of the man. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. I quit my job as a delivery driver the next day. The extra money wasn't worth the risk. But even weeks later, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every time I saw an old car parked near my house, or got a call from an unknown number, the same cold fear gripped me. The police said it was hard to track someone like that it could have been a homeless person or someone who didn't even live in the city, but I knew he was out there. Now I live with constant caution. I changed my daily route, bought security cameras for my home, and always carry pepper spray with me. But the worst part isn't the fear of him coming back. It's not knowing when. The moment I saw the eyes of the children, I knew something was terribly wrong. What should have been a routine babysitting job turned into a night of unimaginable horror, and I was caught in the middle of it. It was supposed to be an easy job. I had been babysitting for the Wilson family for months, Emma, 8 years old, and Tyler, 6. Every Friday night, the Wilsons always came home before midnight. The kids usually went to bed by 9, and I used that time to catch up on work while earning a little extra money. A win-win. That Friday started like any other. I arrived at 6 p.m. and I was greeted by the hurried, almost frantic Mrs. Wilson as she hurriedly put on her earrings. Mr. Wilson, already in the car, impatiently honked the horn, tapping on the emergency numbers taped to the fridge. "The kids need to be in bed by 9. No sugar after 7, Mrs. Wilson said, her words coming in the same rehearsed speech I had heard at least a dozen times before. "Oh, and Sarah," she added, lowering her voice, "the kids have been a little off lately. Probably just a virus going around the school, nothing to worry about, I'm sure." With that cryptic remark, she left, leaving me alone with Emma and Tyler. At first, everything seemed normal. We had macaroni and cheese for dinner, Emma's favorite, and I let them watch some TV while I focused on my calculus homework. But as the night went on, I started to notice little things, strange things. Emma, usually talkative and full of energy, was unsettlingly quiet. She sat on the couch, staring at the TV, but it was as if she wasn't even watching. Tyler, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. He paced the living room, occasionally pressing his ear to the wall, like he was listening for something. "Are you guys okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light, trying to ignore the unease creeping in. "You feeling all right?" They both turned to look at me, and a chill ran down my spine. There was something off about their eyes, too wide, their pupils dilated, almost completely black, reflecting the light in a way that was unnatural. "We're fine," Emma said, her voice flat and motionless. "Everything's fine." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. "Okay, well, it's almost bedtime. How about you go upstairs and get ready?" But neither of them moved. They just kept staring at me with those unsettling eyes. "Sarah," Tyler said, his voice strangely deep for a 6-year-old. "Do you want to play a game?" Before I could respond, the lights flickered, once, twice, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I heard movements, the sound of small feet sliding across the wooden floor. "Emma? Tyler?" I called out, fumbling for my phone, using its light as a makeshift flashlight. "Where are you?" The screen's eerie blue glow lit up the room, but the children were nowhere to be seen. My heart was racing as I rushed to the kitchen, trying to find the fuse box. As I passed the foot of the stairs, I heard a distorted laugh from above. It didn't sound like Emma or Tyler, it sounded wrong. I found the fuse box and flipped the switches. The lights flickered back to life, and I let out a relieved sigh. But that relief was short-lived. As I turned to face the living room, I froze, my blood turning cold. On the wall, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "Play with us, Sarah." It had to be a joke, right? Some elaborate prank by the Wilsons. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't. The fear I felt was too real. I sprinted for the front door, desperate to escape, but it wouldn't open. The doorknob turned, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. "Emma? Tyler?" I screamed, my voice breaking with panic. "This isn't funny! Get out here right now!" In response, I heard that same distorted laugh again, this time from the kitchen. I spun around, and there they were, standing in the doorway. But they weren't Emma and Tyler anymore. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. Their mouths were stretched into unnatural grins, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. And their eyes, oh my God, their eyes were completely black, like bottomless pits. "What's wrong, Sarah?" Emma asked, her voice rasping, an eerie parody of her usual tone. "Don't you want to play?" I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. "What are you?" I whispered, my back pressed against the closed door. Tyler tilted his head at an unnatural angle, his grin widening. "We're hungry, Sarah," he said, his voice unnervingly deep. "So hungry." "You smell delicious." They began moving toward me, their clumsy, uncoordinated movements like puppets controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. I frantically scanned my surroundings, searching for a weapon, anything to defend myself. My eyes landed on the umbrella stand by the door. I grabbed an umbrella, holding it in front of me like a sword. "Stay away!" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. They stopped, their terrible black eyes locking onto mine, then, all at once, they started laughing. It was a horrible sound, like nails scraping against a chalkboard, mixed with the growl of a wild animal. I seized their brief distraction and sprinted toward the stairs. If I could make it to the second floor, maybe there'd be a window to escape through. I took the stairs 2 at a time, their laughter echoing behind me. I burst into the main room, slammed the door shut, and shoved a heavy dresser in front of it. Panting, I ran to the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. I grabbed a lamp from the nightstand and smashed the glass, not caring about the cuts I got on my hand. Just as I was about to climb out onto the roof, a sound froze my heart. From the other side of the bedroom door, a soft, sing-song voice reached my ears. "Sarah, oh Sarah, why are you running? The fun's just beginning." The dresser began to move, inch by inch, as if something invisible was pushing it. I knew time was running out. I climbed out the window onto the roof, the jagged edges of broken glass tearing at my clothes. I looked down, The ground seemed impossibly far, but I had no choice. From inside the room, I heard the door creak open. I jumped. The fall felt like it lasted forever. Then the impact. A sharp, explosive pain shot through my leg when I landed awkwardly. But the adrenaline kept me moving, limping as fast as I could toward the street, too afraid to look back. I reached my neighbor's house, pounding on the door with all my strength, screaming for help. The porch light flickered on, and I heard the sound of the deadbolt being undone. When the door opened, I risked a glance back at the Wilsons' house. Emma and Tyler were standing by the upstairs window, their black eyes fixed on me, those terrible smiles still on their faces. Then, just as my neighbor yanked me inside, they disappeared. The police arrived, of course. They searched the house but found nothing unusual. No blood on the walls, no broken windows. Emma and Tyler were asleep in their beds, seemingly normal. The Wilsons returned home, confused and worried. No one believed me. How could they? Even I thought it sounded like madness. They chalked it up to stress or maybe a reaction to some medication. They sent me home with a twisted ankle and the suggestion of a good therapist. But I know what I saw. I know what happened that night was real. I stopped working as a babysitter after that. I couldn't stand the thought of being alone with kids again. My friends think I'm exaggerating, that I'm letting one bad experience ruin something I once enjoyed. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel the terror I felt. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that distorted laughter in my dreams. I see those black eyes staring at me from the darkness. I ask myself, what if it happens again? What if the next time there's no way out? I have no answers. All I know is that the world is darker and more dangerous than I ever imagined. And somewhere, 2 children with black eyes and sharp teeth are waiting, hungry for their next victim. So if you ever find yourself babysitting and something feels off, if the children start acting strange or their eyes seem too dark, don't hesitate. Don't try to rationalize it, just run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because you never know when a seemingly normal night as a babysitter could turn into a nightmare. The first time I saw my neighbor dragging a bag, suspiciously shaped like a human body, toward his basement, I told myself it was just my overactive imagination. But by the 3rd time, I knew I was living next to a monster. It all started on a completely normal Tuesday night. I had just moved into my new rental house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, seeking a fresh start after a complicated breakup. The house was old and creaky, but it had character, and most importantly, it was affordable. I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I noticed him for the first time. My new neighbor was a tall, thin man with graying hair and thin-framed glasses. From my window, I watched as he methodically mowed his immaculate lawn. There was something strange about the way he moved, too precise, too controlled, but I brushed it off. After all, I've always been prone to overthinking. That night, as I settled into bed, I heard a noise, a sound like something being dragged, followed by a heavy thud. Intrigued, I peeked out of my bedroom window. In the dim glow of the streetlight, I saw my neighbor struggling with what appeared to be a large, heavy bag. He was dragging it toward the door of his basement. For a brief moment, just a second, I thought I saw the bag move, but then it disappeared into the basement. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light. He was probably just getting rid of some old trash, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I saw my neighbor leave his house with a briefcase in hand, looking like the epitome of the respectable suburban professional. He even waved at me. As I got into my car, I waved back, feeling a little silly for my late-night paranoia. But then, it happened again. And again. Always late at night, always when it seemed like no one was watching. The same ritual, something being dragged, the struggle with the bag, the disappearance into the basement. Each time, I felt more certain that what I was seeing wasn't normal. I began paying closer attention to my neighbor. His name was Harold, as he told me during a brief chat over the fence. He was polite, though a bit reserved, and worked as an accountant in the city. He didn't seem out of the ordinary, but the more I watched him, the more I noticed small details that didn't add up. His trash cans were always almost empty on garbage day, even though he lived alone. Occasionally, a strange chemical smell would emanate from his property at night. Sometimes he'd stand in his backyard, staring into the horizon with an unsettling intensity. I knew I should call the police, but what would I tell them? That my seemingly normal neighbor was dragging suspicious bags into his basement? That I had a bad feeling? They'd think I was crazy, or worse, just a nosy neighbor causing trouble. So I decided to do what I now know was a huge mistake. I decided to investigate on my own. I started keeping a detailed log of Harold's movements. I noted the times he left for work, when he came home, and most importantly, when he made those unsettling late-night trips to the basement. I even bought binoculars to get a better look. If anyone had seen me, they would have thought I was the crazy person on the block. Over time, a pattern emerged. The trips to the basement always happened on Friday nights, usually around 2 a.m. They were always preceded by Harold coming home much later than usual, often in a car I didn't recognize. Finally, one night, I decided to get closer. Harold had left. With the kind of bravery that only fear and curiosity can give you, I crossed onto his property. The basement windows were level with the ground, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. I pushed the branches aside, my heart pounding so loudly that I was certain someone could hear it. Pressing my face against the cold glass, I peered inside. What I saw still haunts me to this day. The basement was eerily spotless, almost clinical. Fluorescent lights illuminated a space that looked more like a laboratory than a typical suburban basement. There were tables covered with equipment I couldn't identify, shelves filled with jars of mysterious substances, and in the center, a large metal table with straps. But it was the walls that truly terrified me. Photographs, dozens of them, covered the walls, each showing a different person. Men and women of various ages. Some of the photos were crossed out with furious red marks. I stumbled backward, my mind spinning. This was evidence. Concrete proof that something horrifying was happening in that basement. I had to do something. I ran back to my house, struggling to dial 911 with trembling fingers. But just as I was about to press call, the headlights of a car flooded my living room. Harold was back. Panic flooded me. What if he had seen me? What if he knew I knew? I couldn't call the police now, not with him so close. He'd hear the sirens and know it was me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I turned on every light in my house and cranked the TV volume to the max. I made as much noise as possible, hoping to disrupt whatever he was planning. It worked, sort of. Harold hesitated, staring at my house with a mixture of confusion and anger. Then, instead of heading to the basement, he dragged the bag toward the garage. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, I called the police. I told them everything, the bags, the basement, the photos on the walls. I probably sounded crazy, but something in my voice must have convinced them to at least investigate. Within hours, our quiet street was flooded with police cars. I watched from my window as they knocked down Harold's door, dragged him out in handcuffs, and brought in dogs to search the property. And that's when the discoveries began: bodies buried in the backyard, evidence of horrific crimes in the basement. As the investigation unfolded, Harold's victim count grew. The entire neighborhood was in shock. How had this happened in our peaceful suburb? How had no one noticed before? But I had noticed. And the guilt of not acting sooner crushed me. Could I have saved someone if I had gone to the police earlier? In the weeks that followed, the media flooded our street, hungry for every detail. I couldn't escape the constant reminders of what had happened just next door. I couldn't look at Harold's house without imagining the horrors that had taken place inside. Eventually, I couldn't stay anymore. I moved less than a month after his arrest, but the memories followed me. Now, years later, I still watch my neighbors too closely. Every strange sound, every odd nighttime activity sets me on edge. I know it's irrational, but I can't help it. Because once you've seen the darkness that can hide behind an apparently normal facade, it's impossible to unsee it. If you ever have that nagging feeling that something's not right, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, the monster isn't hiding under the bed or in the closet. It's right next door, mowing the lawn and waving at you.